She gave him 11 minutes. That's all he got. Scarlett Hayes had built an empire before most people figured out what they wanted for breakfast. She didn't waste time on the wrong investments. Not in business, and certainly not in men. So when the blind date showed up in a flannel shirt with grease still on his sleeve, looking like he'd rather be under a car than sitting across from her, she made her decision before the coffee even cooled. She smiled. She excused herself. She left. What she didn't know, what nearly cost her everything, was already parked right outside the window. If this story finds you wherever you're watching from, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit that like button, stay until the end, and let's get into it. The morning Scarlett Hayes agreed to the blind date. She was standing in her kitchen at 6:43 in the morning, still in her robe, holding a cup of black coffee, and staring at the rain hitting the harbor. She had 17 unread emails from her VP of Operations, a board presentation in 4 days, a contractor dispute in Savannah that had already cost her 2 weeks, and a migraine that medication barely touched. And somewhere in Charleston, a family she loved but occasionally wanted to mail to another continent was very excited about a man they'd found for her. "He's not from the industry," her mother had said, as if that were a selling point. "He works with his hands." Scarlett had said nothing. "Scarlett, you haven't been on a date in 14 months. "I've been busy." "You're always busy. That's the problem." She'd agreed just to end the conversation. She told herself she'd give it an hour, be polite, make an excuse about a conference call, and be back at her desk by 2. Clean, simple, no drama. She was not expecting drama. She was wrong about that. The cafe her mother had chosen was called Magnolia and Maine, one of those places in the old quarter of Charleston where the ceiling fans moved slowly, the floors were original heart pine, and the menu was handwritten on a chalkboard above the counter. It smelled like roasted coffee beans and something with brown sugar baking in the back. On a Saturday afternoon, it was the kind of place that filled with people who had nowhere urgent to be. Scarlett had somewhere urgent to be. She was simply choosing not to go there for 60 minutes. She arrived 4 minutes early, which was how she arrived everywhere. She dressed carefully without appearing to. Dark-tailored trousers, a cream silk blouse, her hair down because her assistant had once told her that wearing it up made her look like she was about to fire someone. Low heels, nothing flashy. She'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing she could wear into any room was the impression that she wasn't trying. She took the corner table by the window, ordered a cortado, and opened her phone. She did not expect to feel anything when the door opened. She felt something anyway. Ethan Brooks walked in like a man who had forgotten there was any other way to walk. Unhurried, slightly distracted, looking briefly at the ceiling fan the way people do when they're already solving a problem in their head that has nothing to do with where they are. He was tall, broad across the shoulders in a way that flannel shirts quietly announced and tried to contain. Dark hair, a jaw that needed a better introduction to a razor. There was a faint smudge of something, grease or graphite, she couldn't tell which, on the inside of his left wrist, just below his sleeve. He spotted her before she could pretend she hadn't been watching the door. His expression didn't change into a performance. That was the first thing she noticed. No charm switch flipping on, no smile manufactured for the occasion. He just nodded slightly, the way you nod at someone you recognize at the grocery store, and walked over. "Scarlett?" "Yes." She stood out of habit, boardroom habit, and offered her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm but careful, like someone accustomed to knowing exactly how much pressure was appropriate. His hand was rough in the specific way that came from actual use, not a gym. "Ethan." He sat down, glanced at the menu briefly, then set it aside. "Sorry if I kept you. The GPS took me down King Street instead of the back way." "You just got here at exactly the right time," she said, which was true. He was 3 minutes early. "Good." He looked at her directly. Not the practiced eye contact of someone who'd read an article about confidence, just direct, settled. "Your family said you own hotels." "A hospitality company, hotels, event venues, some residential development." She paused. "What did they tell you about me?" "That you were serious and driven, and that I shouldn't call you Scotty." Despite herself, she almost smiled. "My brother made that mistake once. At a company dinner. What happened to him? He had to introduce me to 47 people and explain that my name was, in fact, Scarlett, to each one individually. She wrapped her hands around her cortado. What did they tell you about yourself? He looked briefly amused. It made his face do something interesting. The distraction lifted for just a moment, and he was actually present in a way he hadn't quite been before. Probably not the truth. Which is, the server appeared, and Ethan ordered a regular coffee without looking at the menu, then waited for the server to leave before he answered. I restore cars, he said. Classic, rare, occasionally ridiculous vehicles that rich people have forgotten how to take care of. I run a small shop. It's not glamorous. It's not glamorous. The way he said it wasn't self-deprecating. It was simply factual, the way you'd say the weather was cloudy. No apology, no performance of humility designed to seem charming. Scarlett looked at him, at the flannel shirt, at the faint grease that he either hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to address, at the worn cuffs and the plain watch, and the general absence of anything that suggested he'd thought about this date the way her family clearly had. She felt the first small closing happen somewhere in the back of her mind. Not cruel, not dramatic, just a quiet, businesslike assessment. This is not a fit. How long have you been doing that? She asked, because she was not rude. About 8 years on my own. Worked in other shops before that. He picked up the coffee the server had brought. My daughter likes to say I fix broken things for a living. She's not wrong. You have a daughter? Mia. She's 7. Something happened in his face when he said the name, a small, involuntary softening that he didn't seem aware of. She's with my sister today. She wanted to come. I told her maybe next time. Next time. The assumption embedded in that phrase that there would be a next time registered somewhere Scarlett filed under things to address gently. She sounds sweet. She's relentless, actually. Last week she negotiated an extra 30 minutes of reading time before bed by presenting me with a handwritten document outlining why the current bedtime policy was, and I'm quoting, logistically flawed. Scarlett blinked. She's 7? She really is. He said it with that not-quite smile again. I have no idea where she gets it. This was the moment Scarlett would think about later, when she should have paid more attention to the man actually sitting in front of her instead of the story she'd already written about him. This was the moment the conversation turned briefly, genuinely real. Two people who had both learned to be careful, talking about the one thing that made each of them less careful. But she was already somewhere else in her head. She was looking at the worn shirt and thinking about boardroom dinners and charity galas and the 400-person investor event she had in 6 weeks, and what it would mean to show up to any of those things beside a mechanic who talked about his daughter and fixed cars for a living. She was thinking about her last relationship, which had ended because the man couldn't handle what she earned and what she decided and how little she needed to be told what to do. She was thinking, without meaning to be unkind, that this man was kind, genuinely, clearly kind, and that kindness was not the same as compatible. She was being efficient, the way she was always efficient. She was also, though she didn't know it yet, being catastrophically wrong. The conversation continued for approximately 9 more minutes. Ethan talked about his daughter with the ease of a man for whom that was simply the most interesting topic available. He talked about his shop the way people talk about something they actually love, specifically, technically, without trying to make it sound more impressive than he believed it was. He mentioned once, briefly, a car he'd recently finished, a 1963 Ferrari 250 GT belonging to a private collector, and said it had taken 14 months and that the owner had cried when he saw it. That must have been satisfying, Scarlett said. It was, he said. Not more than that. He asked her one question about her work. A real one, not the performative interest question men sometimes asked women they wanted to impress. And she found herself answering more honestly than she'd intended, saying something about how the development side of the company had started to feel mechanical in a way the original hotel work never had. He listened, actually listened, not waiting for his turn to talk. What did the original work feel like? He asked. She thought about it. Like I was building something that mattered to the people inside it, not just to the quarterly report. He nodded slowly. Yeah. I know that feeling. She believed that he did. And then, because she was who she was, and because she had already decided before she sat down that this would not work, and because part of her was almost afraid of how comfortable this felt, how unexpectedly easy the words came with someone who clearly wanted nothing from her except the conversation, she looked at her phone and did the thing she had planned to do. "I'm so sorry," she said, and she genuinely was, though not entirely for the reason she implied. "I have a call I completely forgot about, a vendor issue in Savannah. It's been a week." Ethan looked at her for a moment, not with hurt, not with irritation, with something quieter and more unsettling. The calm recognition of someone who understood exactly what was happening. "Of course," he said. She pulled on her jacket, left two $20 bills on the table. Too much, but she wanted to be gone before the awkward debate about the check. "This was really nice. I'm sorry to cut it short." "It was nice," he said, not agreeing with the apology, just stating what it had been. She left without looking back, which was how she left most things she wasn't sure about. Outside, the afternoon light fell across the sidewalk in long, warm panels. The street was quiet. She reached into her bag for her keys and glanced up out of habit, and stopped. Parked along the curb in front of Magnolia and Main were 3 cars. Not parked the way people parked on King Street in the afternoon. Parked the way objects of significant, deliberate beauty get placed, each one a slight distance from the next, as if proximity might diminish them. The first was a 1967 Lamborghini Miura, restored to the kind of condition that made automotive historians put their hands over their hearts. Candy apple red. Not a scratch. Not a mar. Nothing to suggest it had ever existed in the same universe as weather or use. The second was a McLaren F1, the original, the 1994 version that serious collectors discussed in the reverent tones of people talking about something irreplaceable. Gunmetal silver. The kind of car that appeared in museums and on short lists, and occasionally in the fevered dreams of people with too much money and very specific passions. The third was a pre-war Bugatti Type 57 that looked like it had been built last week by someone who was very serious about the word perfect. Scarlett stood on the sidewalk and stared. A man walking past slowed down involuntarily. A woman with a stroller on the opposite side of the street had stopped entirely, phone already out. Scarlett's mind did rapid calculations. Each of these cars, in this condition, was worth, not together, each one individually. She turned and looked back through the cafe window. Ethan Brooks was still at the table. He'd picked up the book she'd noticed in his jacket pocket and opened it to wherever he'd left off. He was drinking his coffee. He had not watched her leave. He was reading, like a man with nowhere to be in a hurry, like a man who had already known she was going to do exactly what she did and found the afternoon pleasant anyway. Scarlett stood on the sidewalk in the Charleston afternoon with the most expensive row of automobiles she'd ever seen parked casually behind her and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that she had possibly just made a mistake. She told herself it didn't matter on the drive home. She told herself this twice more that evening, once while reviewing the Savannah contractor reports that had not actually required an emergency call from anyone, and once while standing in her kitchen eating leftover pad thai straight from the container because she'd forgotten to eat a real lunch. The cars bothered her, not because of what they implied about money. Scarlett Hayes was not someone who could be impressed by a display of wealth in a parking lot. She had more money than those 3 cars combined, and she bought her coffee with a card that had her assistant's name on it because carrying a wallet was logistically annoying. What bothered her was the specific contradiction. The flannel shirt, the engine grease, the worn watch. The man who said it's not glamorous about his work with the same flat certainty that he might say it's raining. That man didn't park 3 hypercars in front of a cafe and fail to mention it. That man didn't exist in the same person as those cars without something significant being left unsaid. She picked up her phone at 9:47 in the evening, which was late for a business call and completely reasonable for a research session. She typed, Ethan Brooks, Charleston Automotive Restoration. The first result was a profile piece in a trade publication she'd never heard of called Concours Heritage Quarterly. She clicked it. The headline was, The Man Who Brings the Dead Back to Life. The article was 18 months old and featured photographs of the workshop, clean, meticulous, a converted 19th century warehouse in the North Charleston Industrial District, and photographs of finished restorations that made Scarlett physically slow her scrolling to actually look. A 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing, a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California Spider, a 1970 Porsche 917K. She read the article once quickly, then went back to the beginning and read it slowly. Ethan Brooks had started the company 8 years ago with 3 clients and a lease on a space that had previously been used to store equipment nobody wanted. He had no outside investors, no partners. He had built the business, according to the article, on referrals alone, because he refused to advertise, refused to take on more than 6 restorations at a time, regardless of what was offered, and had a waiting list that currently extended 3 years. 3 years. The article listed some of his clients without using names. A Saudi royal family, it said. A Silicon Valley founder who collects pre-war German engineering. Several names from the Forbes 400 who prefer, for obvious reasons, not to be identified. His estimated annual revenue, referenced obliquely, was in the neighborhood of $12 to $15 million. Scarlett set the phone down, picked it up again. There was a second article, this one from a mainstream financial publication, briefer, less interested in the cars than in the business model. The headline was, "Why the most exclusive auto restorer in America won't return most calls." It quoted Ethan exactly once, in a passage that she read 3 times. "I'm not trying to build a brand, I'm trying to do the work right. Those are different goals, and I've seen what happens when people get them confused." She stared at the ceiling of her living room for a while. She thought about a man who had the self-discipline to turn down money from Forbes' 400 clients because he could only do 6 jobs right at a time, and who showed up to a blind date in a flannel shirt without a single apparent thought about impression management. She thought about a man who had built something multi-million without ever once, apparently, feeling the need to tell anyone about it over coffee. She thought about herself, standing up and making an excuse about a phone call that didn't exist, leaving 2 20s on the table like punctuation and walking out the door. She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and said nothing to the empty room. She was going to have to go to that workshop. She didn't want to admit that, but she was already reaching for her phone to look up the address. She didn't call ahead. She thought about it. Scarlett Hayes called ahead for everything: coordinated arrivals, prepared talking points, controlled variables. It was how she operated. It was, if she was honest, how she survived the specific kind of professional environment she'd chosen, where showing up unprepared was a version of showing up wrong. But something about calling ahead felt dishonest in a way she couldn't quite articulate. So the next afternoon, a Sunday, which felt less calculated than a weekday, though she immediately recognized this logic as the kind of reasoning she'd critique in an employee. She drove to the address she'd found and pulled up outside a converted warehouse on a quiet stretch of the North Charleston Industrial Corridor. The building was larger than she'd expected. The exterior was clean, recently painted in a deep charcoal gray, with the company name on a modest sign beside the entrance, Brooks Restoration. No logo, no tagline. Just the name, in clean serif type, like a law firm that had been around long enough to not need to explain itself. The main bay doors were partially open. She could hear music. Something old, she couldn't place it. Jazz maybe, or blues with a slow tempo. And the particular quality of silence that falls between sounds in a place where someone is concentrating. She got out of the car. She was wearing jeans and a linen shirt, which was her version of dressing down, and had debated the silk blouse and decided against it. She didn't want to look like she was performing casualness. She also, she admitted to herself as she approached the entrance, didn't want to look like she'd put excessive thought into this, which she absolutely had. She knocked on the open door frame. Nothing for a moment. Then a small voice said, "Hello?" Scarlett looked down. A girl of about 7, slight, with dark hair and an aggressively lopsided braid that suggested it had been self-administered, was standing just inside the bay, holding a small wrench that was clearly not being used for any mechanical purpose. She had her father's direct eyes and a smudge of something on her chin that mirrored the smudge on Ethan's wrist from the day before, which made Scarlett's chest do something unexpected. "Hi," Scarlett said. "I'm Scarlett. Is your dad here?" The girl studied her with the particular intensity of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. "You're the lady from the date," she said. Scarlett blinked. "He told you about that?" "He said it was fine." The girl considered this. "He says things are fine when they're not great, but he doesn't want to talk about it." Scarlett had exactly no idea what to do with that information, so she filed it and moved on. "Is he—" "Mia." Ethan's voice came from somewhere deeper in the bay. "Who are you?" He appeared from behind a car that was under a cotton cover, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped when he saw her. He looked different than yesterday. He was in a worn gray t-shirt now, and there was more grease, actual occupation, she understood now, not carelessness, on both forearms. His hair was slightly disheveled. He looked like a man who had been working for several hours and had not given a single thought to how that appeared. He also looked, she noticed with a directness that surprised her, very capable. There was something in the way he stood in that space, easy, certain, unhurried, that read differently now that she understood what the space was. "Scarlett," he said, not a question, not particularly surprised. "I should have called," she said. "Probably." He didn't seem bothered by it. He glanced at Mia, who was still watching Scarlett with focused interest. "Mia, why don't you go get that break diagram I asked you to look at?" "I already looked at it." "Look at it again." Mia assessed the situation with apparent strategic clarity, concluded the adult conversation was going to be more interesting than the break diagram, but correctly identified that she was being dismissed rather than invited. She handed Scarlett the wrench, for no discernible reason, and walked off toward a side room. Scarlett looked at the wrench in her hand. "She does that," Ethan said. "I don't know what it means either." Scarlett almost laughed. "I found the articles," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of it. The business, the—" She made a gesture that was meant to encompass the 3 hypercars she still hadn't stopped thinking about. "I left because I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I was making assumptions about who you were based on what you were wearing, and that wasn't fair. I wanted to come and say that." There was a pause. Ethan folded the rag once and set it on a nearby workbench. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You didn't know me." "I know, but I made a judgment call on no actual information, and I make enough decisions that matter to know when I've made a bad one." He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention she'd noticed at the cafe, not trying to interpret her, not calibrating a response, just actually looking. "Is that what you came here for?" he said. "The apology?" "Partly," she admitted. "What's the other part?" She held up the wrench. "Apparently Mia thinks I should borrow this." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. The genuine version, not the cafe version that was polite and contained. "Do you want to see the workshop?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I really do." He showed her the space the way someone shows you their house when they're not trying to impress you, pointing out what was interesting because it was genuinely interesting, not because he needed her to think well of it. The warehouse was divided into 3 main bays. The first was the active restoration floor, currently housing 4 cars in various stages of disassembly and reconstruction, each surrounded by a constellation of labeled parts, documentation, reference photographs. The second was finishing, paint, bodywork, the work that looked, Ethan explained, easier than it was, and that people consistently underestimated. The third was what he called the archive room, which had nothing to do with restoration and everything to do with documentation, floor-to-ceiling shelving of files, photographs, service records, provenance papers. "You document everything," Scarlett said, standing in the archive room and turning slowly. "Every car that comes through here has a complete record of what was done and why. Materials used, sourcing, decisions made where the original specs were unclear." He leaned against the doorframe. "Some of these cars are worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime. The owner deserves to know exactly what they have." "And the ones you turned down?" He paused. "What do you know about the ones I turned down?" "The article mentioned a waiting list. It also mentioned you take 6 at a time. That's a choice, not a limitation." He studied her with new attention. Recalibrating slightly, she could see it. I turn down probably 4 out of every 5 inquiries, he said. Sometimes because the car isn't right. Sometimes because the client isn't right. If someone wants a car to sell at auction 6 months after I finish it, that's their business. But it's not my work. That must cost you a significant amount of money. Significant, he agreed, and left it there, with no apparent distress. She thought about that while he led her back through the active bay, stopping beside a car under a cotton cover that he lifted one corner of to show her. A 1969 Aston Martin DBS, midnight blue, currently missing its interior and half its trim. This one's going to take about a year, he said. A year for one car. The leather for the seats has to be sourced from the same tannery that supplied Aston Martin in 1969. They still exist, in England. The owner wants it done correctly. He replaced the cover. Most people hear that and think it's excessive. And you? I think if something's worth doing at all, it's worth knowing the difference between what's right and what's close enough. He looked at her. You probably have your own version of that in your business. She thought about the first hotel she'd built, the Beaufort property, a converted 19th century inn that she'd refused to modernize beyond what was functionally necessary because the building itself was the entire point. She'd had the same fight with her board 4 separate times in 18 months. Yes, she said, I do. Mia reappeared from the side room, having apparently decided the brake diagram had received sufficient attention. She attached herself to Ethan's side without ceremony and looked up at Scarlett. Do you know what car that is? She asked, pointing at the covered Aston Martin. I was just told it's a 1969 Aston Martin DBS, Scarlett said. Mia looked satisfied. I know what all of them are. Dad quizzes me. Does he? I got the Bugatti Type 57 wrong once because I said Type 57S. She considered this. It was still almost right. The Atlantic and the regular 57 are genuinely different cars, Ethan said to Scarlett. She has a point. I always have a point, Mia said, without a trace of arrogance, just the matter-of-fact clarity of someone stating something they've observed to be empirically true. Scarlett looked at this child, this small, self-possessed, grease-chinned person with the lopsided braid and the wrench she'd gifted to a stranger, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel on a Sunday afternoon in a car workshop. Something that was warm and almost painful at the same time, like a muscle you'd forgotten you had. She'd been around children the way rich people are around children, at the holiday parties of colleagues, in the lobbies of family-friendly properties, at the occasional niece's birthday, where she showed up and gave an excellent gift and left after an hour because she had a call. This was different. This child was looking at her like she was a person of interest rather than a fixture in her father's adult life, and something about that directness, that uncurated attention, went straight past Scarlett's professional scaffolding and landed somewhere more honest. Your braid is coming out, Scarlett said, because it was the first thing she could think of to say. Mia reached up and felt it, made a face. Dad did it. In my defense, Ethan said, I had 6 minutes before the school bus. It was 9 minutes, Mia said. I counted. She counted, he confirmed to Scarlett, with a look that was simultaneously exasperated and proud in a way that was genuinely difficult to look at directly. Scarlett said, Would you like me to fix it? She had not planned to say that. She didn't entirely know where it came from. Mia looked at her carefully, then at her father, then back at Scarlett. Okay, she said. She sat on an overturned crate in the workshop of one of the most respected private automotive restoration companies in the country and rebraided the hair of a 7-year-old girl who handed her the elastic from her own wrist and held very still, asking questions the entire time. Do you have kids? No? Do you want them? Mia, Ethan said from 3 feet away, where he was pretending to review something on a clipboard. It's a normal question, Mia said. It's okay, Scarlett said. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. Dad says it's okay not to have figured everything out. He says he hasn't figured everything out either. A pause. I think he's figured out more than he says, though. Scarlett glanced at Ethan, who was looking at the clipboard with excessive focus. What kind of hotels do you have? Mia asked. Historic ones, mostly. Old buildings that have been restored. Mia was quiet for a moment, like what Dad does, but for buildings. Scarlett's hand slowed slightly on the braid. I suppose so. Yes. Huh, Mia said, with the exact tone of someone filing that information somewhere. When the braid was done, even secure, properly French this time, Mia hopped off the crate and examined herself in a piece of reflective aluminum leaning against the wall, then turned around. Better, she announced. Much better, Scarlett agreed. Mia studied her for one more moment. You should come back, she said, on a non-date day. From behind the clipboard, Ethan made a sound that was almost certainly not a laugh. Maybe I will, Scarlett said. She meant it in the polite way you say things when a child says something sweet. She had no idea, walking back out into the Charleston afternoon, that she meant it in every other way too. She drove home through the long way, past the harbor, past the old rice fields that stretched away from the road in long, flat panels of green and gold in the late afternoon sun. And she didn't turn the radio on. She thought about a man who turned down Forbes' 400 clients because he could only do 6 jobs correctly at a time, and didn't feel the need to explain that to anyone. She thought about a child who negotiated bedtime with written documentation and handed her wrench to strangers and said, I think he's figured out more than he says. She thought about the way Ethan Brooks stood in his own space, certain, quiet, entirely comfortable inside the life he'd built, and didn't offer a single performance of it to anyone who walked through the door. She thought about the 11 minutes she'd given him. She merged onto the highway and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and uncomfortable sensation of being someone who needed to reconsider something important. Not because she'd been wrong about who he was in the practical sense. He was still a man who fixed cars, still someone whose daily life looked nothing like hers, still a single father in a flannel shirt in a workshop in North Charleston. Those things hadn't changed. What had changed was what she understood those things to mean. A man who had quietly built a multi-million-dollar business and never once used it to dress better or arrive louder was telling her something about what he valued. A man who took 6 jobs at a time because that was the number he could do right was telling her something about his standards. A man who raised a child alone, who had lost someone he clearly had loved, and who stood in his workshop on a Sunday afternoon and showed a stranger exactly what his life was without apology or performance. That man was not the man she'd walked out on in 11 minutes. Or rather, he was exactly that man. She had just been looking at the wrong things. She pulled into the garage of her townhouse and sat for a moment in the quiet with the engine off. Through the windshield, the evening light was going amber. She thought about what Mia had said. You should come back. On a non-date day. She thought about what it would mean to actually do that. It scared her in a way that a board presentation or a fraud investigation or a contractor dispute had never once scared her, because those things were problems she knew how to solve, and this was something else entirely. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She went inside, and she made dinner for one, and she did not read any more articles about Ethan Brooks that evening because she had a feeling she'd already learned the most important things. And none of them had come from a magazine. They'd come from a workshop. And from a 7-year-old with a lopsided braid who saw, with the uncomplicated clarity of someone too young to talk herself out of the truth, that Scarlett Hayes had walked into her father's life carrying a wrench she didn't know what to do with, and maybe, just maybe, had needed to be there the whole time. Outside the cafe, the 3 cars sat in the afternoon sun. Nobody who drove past them knew who they belonged to. Nobody inside the cafe was making a point of it. And that, Scarlett would eventually understand, was exactly the point. She went back on a Wednesday. She told herself it was because she was passing through the North Charleston corridor anyway. There was a property site she needed to review 2 miles from the industrial district, a potential acquisition her development team had flagged, and it made geographic sense to stop by the workshop while she was in the area. She told herself this with the same straight face she used in negotiations, which meant she almost believed it. The truth was she'd thought about Mia's braid 3 separate times on Monday, and twice on Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning she woke up at 5:48 and lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet and decided that she was done arguing with herself about something this straightforward. She wanted to go back, so she was going back. That was all. She didn't call ahead this time either, but for a different reason than before. The first time she'd avoided calling because it felt dishonest. This time she avoided it because calling felt like too much pressure in the wrong direction, like it would turn a simple thing into an occasion, and she didn't want an occasion. She wanted to walk in the way she had on Sunday and see what happened with no architecture around it. The property site took 40 minutes. The site manager was late. The access road was worse than the photographs had suggested, and by the time Scarlett was back in her car, her good linen shirt had a hemline of red clay dust, and she had decided the acquisition needed another 3 months of due diligence before she'd sign anything. She pulled up outside Brooks Restoration at 11:23 in the morning. The bay doors were fully open today. The music was different, something with a guitar, still old, still unhurried. She could see the silhouette of someone moving inside, slow and deliberate, the specific economy of motion that comes from doing precise physical work for a long time. She got out, knocked on the door frame again. "Ethan?" He came out from behind the Aston Martin, which was further along than it had been on Sunday. She could see the dashboard was partially reassembled, which meant nothing to her technically, but looked significant. He had safety glasses pushed up on his forehead and grease in the specific distribution of someone who had been working steadily for hours. He looked at her, then at her shirt. "Property visit?" The access road was optimistic on paper. They usually are. He set down the tool in his hand. She didn't know what it was called, something with a long handle and a precise head, and pulled the glasses off his forehead. "No Mia today. She's at school." "I know, I wasn't—" She stopped. "I'm not here because of Mia." "Okay. I'm here because I wanted to continue the conversation from Sunday." "Which part?" She looked at him steadily. "The part where you asked what I came for and I said partly the apology." A beat. He reached for the rag on the workbench, the same gesture she'd seen twice now, the automatic clean hands reflex, and said, "There's coffee in the back. It's not good coffee, but it's hot." "That's fine," she said. She followed him through the workshop, past the covered Aston Martin and the 1965 Jaguar E-Type, in the next bay that she hadn't noticed on Sunday, through a side door into a room that served as an office and a break room and probably several other functions simultaneously. There was a metal desk covered in papers, a whiteboard with what appeared to be a parts diagram in blue marker, 2 mismatched chairs, a filing cabinet with a drawing on it done in crayon, a car, clearly, with disproportionately large wheels and a smiling driver, and a coffee maker that had been in service long enough to have developed character. He poured 2 cups without asking how she took hers. She drank black coffee, so this worked. They sat in the mismatched chairs, and she looked at the crayon drawing on the filing cabinet and said, "Mia?" "Last year. The car is meant to be the Bugatti, I think, but the proportions got away from her." "The driver looks happy." She said that was me. He considered the drawing. "I look like that sometimes, apparently." Scarlett looked at him. She thought he probably did. She didn't say that. "Tell me about your wife," she said instead, and immediately felt the bluntness of it land in the room. Ethan didn't flinch, but there was a pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to be angry, but the pause of someone deciding how much of a real answer to give. "That's a direct question," he said. "I know. You don't have to answer it." "Her name was Claire," he said. "She was a structural engineer. She was smarter than me about most things, and she knew it, and she never made me feel like that was a problem." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "She died when Mia was 2, ovarian cancer. It went fast once they found it, which is both the worst and the best thing I can say about it." Scarlett said nothing. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of the guitar still coming from somewhere in the workshop. "Mia doesn't really remember her," Ethan said. "She knows about her. We talk about her. She has photographs and she has one of Claire's old sweaters that she still sleeps with, which is—" He stopped for a moment. "It's a lot of things at once, that sweater. But she doesn't have memory. She has story." He looked up. "There's a difference." "Yes," Scarlett said softly. "There is." He looked at her with the question in his expression rather than his voice. She shook her head slightly. "Not yet. Not now. Maybe later." And he accepted that without pushing. "Is that why you didn't—" she began, then changed direction. "When we met, you didn't seem bothered when I left. Most people would have been bothered." "I wasn't not bothered," he said. "I just know what assumptions look like. I grew up getting them from the other direction. Everyone expecting something from me because of how I looked, not because of who I was. Now it goes the other way. Either direction, it tells you more about the person making the assumption than the person it's aimed at. He paused. That sounds more philosophical than I meant it. No, it doesn't, she said. It sounds like someone who's thought about it. I've had time to think about it. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, a truck went past on the industrial road, and the guitar recording cycled into something slower. The room smelled like coffee and machine oil and old paper. I want to be honest with you, she said, about what I thought when I left the cafe. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. She met his eyes. I want to, because I think you deserve to know what I was actually doing and not the polished version of it. She held the coffee cup in both hands. I looked at you and I made a calculation. I do that. It's not a good habit. It's just what I do. I calculated that you were kind and genuine and probably a decent person, and that none of that mattered because I couldn't see how you fit into the life I have. The dinners, the events, the expectations people have about who I show up with, and what that says about me. She stopped. I reduced you to a logistical problem, and that was wrong. The room was very quiet. Okay, Ethan said. That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? I don't know, something. More than okay. He looked at her with that direct, settled attention. You came back, he said. That's already more than most people do? She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and for once in her professional life that felt right. They sat in the mismatched chairs for another 40 minutes, talking about things that had no agenda. She told him about the Beaufort property, the first hotel she'd restored, the fights with the board, the way the building had felt different when she walked through it after the renovation was complete, like it had exhaled. He listened without the performing listening face that people in business meetings wore. He told her about a Porsche 356 he'd turned down earlier that year, the first time he'd ever turned something down because of the car itself rather than the client. The car had been modified so extensively by a previous owner that what the current owner wanted wasn't restoration but fabrication, and he couldn't in good conscience call what he'd produce original. What did the owner say when you told him? She asked. He offered me twice the asking price. And I said the price wasn't the issue. He looked at her steadily. He didn't understand that. He kept going back to the number. Some people can only negotiate with what they understand, she said. Yeah. Something moved through his expression. Some people. She left at 12:40. She had a 1 o'clock call she actually couldn't move. At the door of the workshop, she turned back and said, without much deliberation, Next Wednesday? He leaned in the office doorway. I'll make sure the coffee's still not good. She drove to her 1 o'clock call with the windows down, which she never did, because the Charleston air in October had that particular quality, warm, but not summer-heavy, smelling like tidal grass and salt, that she associated with being somewhere she wanted to be. She was late by 4 minutes. She didn't apologize, which was not unusual, but she noticed she wasn't thinking about the call as she sat down at the conference table. She was thinking about a crayon drawing of a car with a smiling driver on a filing cabinet in a back office in North Charleston. She made herself pay attention. It took slightly longer than it normally did. That was new. The Wednesdays became a thing without anyone deciding they would. The third Wednesday, she brought good coffee from the roaster on King Street because she could not in good conscience continue consuming what came out of that machine. And Ethan looked at the bag with an expression of mild affront that lasted approximately the 4 seconds it took him to try it, after which he said nothing, but made a point of drinking 2 cups. Mia was there on the third Wednesday because it was a half day at school. She arrived in a yellow school bus that Ethan had apparently forgotten was coming, which he discovered by checking his phone mid-conversation and saying, in a way that suggested the word stood in for something more colorful. She can stay, Scarlett said. She doesn't need an invitation. She lives here part-time. But he looked relieved. Mia came through the bay door, dragging her backpack, and stopped when she saw Scarlett. You came back, she said, with the tone of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. I did. I told Dad you would. She dropped the backpack next to the wall with a thud that was roughly 40% of her body weight and climbed onto the stool by the workbench like she'd done it 10,000 times. He said he didn't know. I said I wasn't sure, Ethan corrected. Same thing. Mia opened her backpack and extracted a notebook. I have to do a project about something that takes a long time to build. Can I write about the cars? That's my project, Ethan said. I know. I'm writing about you. She looked at Scarlett. What do you build that takes a long time? Scarlett thought about it. Right now? A foundation for preserving historic neighborhoods? It's been in planning for about a year. Mia wrote something in the notebook. What's a foundation? An organization that does work for the public good instead of for profit. Mia stopped writing and looked at her with what appeared to be genuine interest. So you don't get paid? The foundation doesn't make money, but the people who work for it do. How does it get money then? Donors, grants, fundraising. Mia considered this with the expression of someone running an economic analysis. That sounds harder than just selling something. It is considerably harder, Scarlett agreed. From across the workshop, Ethan was watching this exchange with an expression that he seemed unaware he was making. Something between proud and undone, the specific look of a parent watching their child be themselves in front of another adult and finding it both ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. Scarlett caught it and looked away before he noticed she'd seen it. The fourth Wednesday, she brought blueprints. Not for any strategic reason. She'd been reviewing them all morning for the Foundation's first target site, a block of 19th century row houses in the Radcliffe Borough neighborhood that the city had flagged for demolition in 18 months if no preservation plan emerged. And she was thinking about them while she drove, and when she got to the workshop, she spread them on Ethan's workbench between two engine components and said, "Tell me if this structure makes sense." He looked at her. "I'm not an architect." "No, but you look at old structures and figure out what's worth preserving and what's compromised. That's the same question." She pointed to a section of the foundation drawings. "The preservation engineer says this load-bearing wall can stay. The contractor says it needs to come out. I want a third opinion from someone who isn't being paid by either side." He leaned over the blueprints for a long time without talking. He asked two questions, about the age of the original construction and about whether there had been any documented water damage to the basement, and she answered them. He was quiet for another minute. "The contractor's wrong," he said, "or he's right about a different problem. That wall isn't the issue. Look here." He pointed to a section of the roofline drawing. "This is where your water's going. If it's been going there for 30 years, the wall below it is secondary. Fix the source, then reassess the wall." She looked at where he was pointing. She pulled out her phone and called her preservation engineer. "I need you to take another look at the roofline on the Radcliffe Borough site," she said when he picked up. "Specifically, the southeast section. I think we've been diagnosing a symptom." There was a pause on the line, then, "Where's this coming from?" "A second opinion," she said. She looked at Ethan, who had gone back to the Aston Martin with the equanimity of someone who didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation. "A good one." She was right. The engineer called back that Friday. The roofline was the origin point. The load-bearing wall was salvageable. The contractor, when informed, was irritated in the specific way of someone whose solution had been more expensive than necessary. She told Ethan the following Wednesday. "You saved me about $60,000 and a wall worth preserving," she said. He was replacing a piece of the Aston Martin's interior trim. Delicate work, both hands occupied. "I looked at a drawing for 10 minutes, he said. "You looked at it with the right eyes." He glanced over at her. "You do this a lot? Ask people outside the industry for opinions on your projects?" "Almost never," she admitted. "What made you do it this time?" She thought about it. "I trusted your judgment," she said. "I don't usually trust anyone's judgment quickly." He went back to the trim. "Neither do I," he said. This, she understood, was not nothing. The fifth Wednesday was different in ways neither of them planned. It was raining, the particular persistent Charleston rain that turned the city silver and closed in around you. And Mia was home sick with a mild fever that was almost certainly not serious, but had produced a level of misery disproportionate to its severity, which Ethan explained over the phone when Scarlett was already halfway to the workshop. "I can come another time," she said. "No, come. She's been asking if you were coming since breakfast. It'll probably cheer her up. I'm not great with sick children. She's not that sick. She just wants someone to agree with her that she's suffering dramatically. Scarlett had stopped at a pharmacy out of pure instinct, the way you stop when someone you know is sick, regardless of whether you've planned to, and arrived with ginger ale and a bag of those animal crackers that came in the little circus car box, because Mia had mentioned them once during a conversation about snacks that Scarlett hadn't realized she'd retained until she was standing in the pharmacy aisle. Mia was on the couch in a nest of blankets, her face the particular pale and pink combination of a mild fever, her hair down and tangled. She looked smaller than she did in the workshop. She looked, without the lopsided braid and the wrench and the notebook full of economic analyses, like what she was. A little girl who'd lost her mother at 2 and been raised by a man who loved her entirely and did his best with braids. "You came," Mia said, in a voice calibrated for maximum pathos. "I came." Scarlett sat on the edge of the couch and handed her the animal crackers. Mia looked at the box, then at Scarlett. "I mentioned these once," she said. "You did." Mia's expression went through several stages. "Dad," she called. She remembered. From the kitchen, where he was making soup from a can with the focused attention of a man doing his best, Ethan said, "I heard." Mia pulled a giraffe from the box and ate it. Then she looked at Scarlett with the direct, calculating attention that had not been diminished at all by the fever. "Do you like my dad?" Scarlett kept her expression neutral through considerable effort. "I like your dad," she said carefully. "He's a good person." "I mean, like. Mia." Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "It's a reasonable question," Mia said, which was word for word what she'd said about the "do you want kids" question, and which appeared to be her general position on interrogation. "It's not a reasonable question to ask someone who's a guest," Ethan said. "She's not really a guest anymore." The kitchen went quiet. Ethan looked at his daughter with an expression that was half exasperated and half something he was trying very hard not to let be visible. Scarlett looked at Mia. "Let's focus on you being sick," she said. "I'm not that sick," Mia said, then sneezed enormously. "Extremely sick," Scarlett agreed. Mia, despite everything, smiled. Ethan made the soup and Scarlett sat on the couch and they watched half of an animated film that Mia had selected on the basis of its dragon population. And at some point, Mia fell asleep between them with her feet on Scarlett's lap and the animal cracker box cradled against her chest. And the apartment was quiet except for the rain on the windows and the low volume of the television. Scarlett looked down at the sleeping child and felt the complicated sensation she'd been feeling on and off since the first Wednesday. Warm and dangerous in equal measure. The specific vulnerability of caring about something you hadn't planned to care about. She looked up and found Ethan watching her. Not with an agenda, not trying to create a moment, just watching, the way he did everything, directly, without pretense, seeing what was actually there. "She's not usually this easy with people," he said quietly. "It takes her a while normally." "She's a good judge of character," Scarlett said. "Yeah." He looked at his daughter for a moment. "She is." The rain came harder against the window. Neither of them moved. Scarlett stayed for another hour. They talked in low voices about nothing complicated. She told him about a development meeting that had gone sideways in a way that was, in retrospect, almost funny. He told her about a client who had requested that a specific bolt be sourced from the original manufacturer in Stuttgart, which no longer existed, requiring 3 weeks of supply chain research that had finally resolved through an 84-year-old retired machinist in Bavaria who still had original stock in his garage. She laughed at the Stuttgart story in a way that was too real to be polite, and he looked pleased in the quiet way he looked pleased about things. Not performing it, just being it. When she stood to leave, Mia stirred and said, without fully waking, "Don't go yet." "I'll come back," Scarlett said. Mia settled back into the blankets. Asleep or close enough. At the door, Ethan handed her umbrella to her. She'd left it in the entryway, and they stood for a moment in that particular doorway, space where something is either said or not said, and everything afterward turns on which one it is. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her with the thing he almost never showed, The thing behind the settled and certain exterior, something careful and specific, something that had been through enough to know that wanting something and having it safely were not the same thing. "Drive careful," he said. "The road by the industrial corridor floods when it rains." "I know it does." Yeah." He put his hand briefly on the door frame. "I know you know." She walked to her car through the rain, thinking about two things with equal weight: the warmth of a sleeping child's feet in her lap, and the expression on a man's face at a doorway in a rainstorm, neither performing safety nor reaching past it, just present, in the careful and specific way of someone who had learned the difference between being present and being reckless, and chose presence anyway. She took the long way home again. The rain followed her the whole way back. There were 6 Wednesdays before things changed. In those 6 weeks, she finished the site assessment for Radcliffe Borough and got the city to extend the demolition review period by 4 months. Ethan finished the Aston Martin's interior reassembly and began the paint preparation on a 1972 Ferrari dyno that had arrived from a collector in New Mexico. Mia recovered from her fever, returned to school, completed her project about things that take a long time to build, and received an A, which she texted Scarlett about using Ethan's phone without apparently asking permission. The text said, "I got an A on the project I wrote about you and Dad, and historic preservation and restoration, Mia." And then, 30 seconds later, "P.S. I asked Dad first." This is not unauthorized. Scarlett smiled at her phone in the middle of a board meeting and then looked up to find her CFO waiting for her response on a financial projection and had to reconstruct the last 2 minutes of conversation from context. She responded to Mia that evening, "Congratulations, your hypothesis about things worth preserving was well argued." Mia wrote back, again on Ethan's phone, "Dad says hi." Scarlett wrote, "Tell him I say hi back." 3 minutes passed. Then he said, "Good." She stared at that word, good, for longer than a 30-year-old CEO of a 9-figure company should stare at a text message from a man who expressed himself in single syllables when his 7-year-old was running communications. The thing about Ethan Brooks, she was beginning to understand, was that he said exactly what he meant, and nothing extra. A man who turned down Forbes' 400 clients because the number wasn't the point didn't waste syllables either. Good from Ethan Brooks was probably what finally was from anyone else. She thought she might be right about that. She was afraid to test it too quickly. The Radcliffe Borough site was the thing that moved everything forward, though not in the way she'd planned. She'd been working on the community engagement side, meeting with residents, long-term tenants, the small businesses that had survived 3 waves of gentrification by sheer stubbornness, when she started hearing the same name in conversations she wasn't directing: Richard Vaughn, her EVP of Finance and Operations, the man who had been her right hand for 4 years, the man she'd trusted with budget authority over everything, including the foundation's startup capital. The first mention was oblique. An elderly resident named Mr. Tatum, who'd lived in the same Radcliffe Borough row house for 41 years, told her, without apparent significance, that a man from her company had been asking around the neighborhood 6 months ago, before the foundation was public knowledge, before she'd announced the site. Scarlett had stopped writing in her notebook. "What kind of asking?" she'd said. "Property interest," Mr. Tatum said. "Whether people would sell, what they'd take." He sipped his tea. "He had your company's name on his card. I remember because I looked it up after. Didn't know it was your company till then." She drove back from that meeting and went straight to her office and didn't speak to anyone for 20 minutes. Richard Vaughn had been asking about the Radcliffe Borough properties 6 months ago, 6 months before the foundation, before anyone outside her executive team knew the site was on her radar. She pulled up the foundation's preliminary budget files and went back through them with a different eye than she'd used before. She wasn't looking at overall figures now. She was looking at the line items, the vendor allocations, the consulting fees. She found the first anomaly 40 minutes later: a consulting contract for site assessment services paid out of the foundation's operating account to a company she didn't recognize, $47,000. She clicked on the vendor file. The company had been registered in Delaware 8 months ago. It had 1 employee on record. She searched the registered agent name. It came back to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. She leaned back in her chair. Outside her office window, Charleston spread out in the late afternoon gold, the spire of St. Michael's catching the light the way it always did, the harbor beyond it turning copper. She thought about who she could trust with this. She thought about the answer to that question and what it told her about the 6 Wednesdays and the rain in the doorway and the man who said exactly what he meant and nothing extra. She picked up her phone. "I need to show you something," she said when he answered. "Not Wednesday. Tomorrow. Can you come to my office?" There was a pause. "What's wrong?" "I don't know yet, but I think it might be significant." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I found something in my company's finances that doesn't make sense. I need someone outside the situation to look at it with me." "I look at cars," he said. "I don't know anything about corporate finance." "You know how to look at something and find where the damage actually is," she said. "The rest I can figure out myself. I just need—" She stopped. She was not someone who said, "I need." She had built an entire professional identity on the premise of not needing. "I need someone I trust," she said. "And right now, you're at the top of a short list." The quiet on the other end of the line was the specific quiet of someone taking that seriously. "I'll be there at 10, he said. She hung up and sat in her office while the city went amber outside the window, holding the phone in both hands, thinking about how, in 4 years of working alongside Richard Vaughn, she had never once said those words to him. Someone I trust. She'd said someone I depend on. She'd said someone I can rely on. She'd given him authority and access and the kind of institutional trust that came with proximity and time. She had never told him what she'd just told Ethan Brooks, a man she'd known for 6 Wednesdays and 1 sick afternoon and 1 blind date she'd walked out of in 11 minutes. She was going to have to think about what that meant. But not tonight. Tonight she had a fraud to trace. Ethan arrived at 9:54. Scarlett knew this because she was watching the lobby camera feed from her desk, which was not something she typically did, and which she was not going to examine too closely. She'd told the front desk to send him straight up, bypassing the usual visitor protocol that required a badge and an escort, and she'd done it without thinking about what that gesture communicated to anyone who noticed. He came through the glass doors of the 31st floor in the same flannel, different color, deep blue this time, and the same worn boots, and he looked at the reception area with the mild interest of someone who found the environment informative rather than impressive. He was carrying a paper cup of coffee from somewhere that was not the King Street Roaster, which meant he'd stopped somewhere between North Charleston and here and bought the inferior version, which was the kind of detail that for no logical reason made her feel better about the morning. "You found it okay," she said, meeting him at the reception desk rather than waiting in her office. She hadn't planned to do that either. GPS worked this time. He looked at the view. 31 floors of Charleston spread south toward the harbor, the church spires and the rooftops, and the long, flat green of the tidal marsh beyond the peninsula. "That's something," he said. "I don't notice it anymore," she admitted. "Should." He looked at it for another moment, then turned back to her. "Show me what you found." This was the thing she'd been thinking about since she'd hung up the phone last night, the specific relief of someone who got to the point. No performance of concern, no elaborate preamble, just show me what you found. What? Like a mechanic arriving at a car that needed looking at, present and practical and not making it about himself. She led him into her office and closed the door. The files were already pulled up on her secondary monitor. The vendor contracts, the payment records, the shell company trails she'd spent 3 hours reconstructing the previous evening. She'd printed the key documents and arranged them on the conference table in the corner of her office because she thought better with paper than screens, and she wanted him to be able to see everything at once. He sat down at the table and looked at the spread without touching anything for a full minute. She'd seen him do this with the blueprints, the same quality of stillness, taking the whole picture in before engaging any single part of it. "Walk me through what you know," he said. She walked him through it. The consulting contract for $47,000, the Delaware registration, the Cayman Holding Company, the second anomaly she'd found at midnight, a vendor payment for materials procurement on the Beaufort property renovation, $212,000, to a company that had been incorporated 3 weeks after the renovation was approved and dissolved 4 months after the payment cleared. The third, which she'd found at 2 a.m. with her shoes off and a half-eaten plate of crackers next to the keyboard. A pattern of smaller payments, each individually below the threshold that triggered automatic compliance review, that collectively totaled slightly over $800,000 across 18 months. She laid the last document on the table and stepped back. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How many people have access to approved payments at these levels?" he asked. "Below 50,000, 3 people. Below 500,000, 2 people. Above that, it requires my sign-off." "So the small payments, the ones under the review threshold." 3 people. Myself, my CFO, and my EVP of Finance and Operations. She paused. "Richard Vaughn." Ethan looked at her, not with the dramatic significance that the name deserved in the moment, but with the careful attention of someone assembling a picture. "Your CFO. Do you trust him?" "Margaret Chen, yes, completely, and with documentation I could show you." She sat down across from him. "She's been with me since the 2nd year. She flagged a different compliance issue 8 months ago on her own initiative. She doesn't benefit from the foundation structure the way Richard does." "Does Richard know about the foundation's Radcliffe Borough plans?" "He was in every planning meeting. He had full access to the site assessments, the acquisition strategy, the timeline." She stopped. "He was asking about those properties 6 months ago, before we'd gone public with anything." Ethan was quiet again. "He was positioning himself," he said. "Before you formalized the foundation's interest in the site, he was already finding out what the properties were worth and whether the owners would sell. Which means he knew what we were planning to do with them, and he was figuring out how to intercept that value before I could. Is there a way he could have bought the properties himself? Through a third party?" She'd thought about this. "The Cayman Holding Company. I haven't been able to trace who's behind it. My attorney is working on it." She pressed her fingers to the table. "But even if he didn't get to the properties, this," she gestured at the spread of documents. "The payment trail. 800,000 over 18 months is what I can find. I don't know yet what I can't find." Ethan leaned back in his chair. He was looking at the documents with an expression she recognized from the workshop. The specific focus of someone who is not reacting, just thinking. "You have a board meeting next week," he said. "How do you know that?" "You mentioned it 2 Wednesdays ago. You said it was going to be tedious." He looked at her. "If Richard knows you're looking at this, he moves first, probably before the board meeting." She had thought about that too. At about 3 in the morning, when the crackers were gone and the office was very quiet. "Yes," she said. "Then you need everything documented and locked before he has any reason to think you're looking." He paused. "Does he know you met with the Radcliffe Borough residents?" "Not specifically. He knows the site engagement is ongoing." "But not that Mr. Tatum told you about the visit." "No." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then you have time. Not a lot, but some." He looked at her. "You need a forensic accountant and a lawyer who has nothing to do with your regular corporate counsel, someone Richard doesn't know. I already called someone last night. Former federal prosecutor. She's coming in Thursday." Something moved through his expression, the recalibration she'd seen before, the adjustment that happened when she demonstrated competence he hadn't been expecting, except by now he was expecting it, and what she saw instead was something closer to satisfaction, like watching someone hit a note cleanly. "Okay," he said. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him across the table, covered in evidence of a betrayal that had been running quietly underneath 4 years of professional trust. She'd been asking herself this question since 9 last night. What she'd told him on the phone was true. She needed someone outside the situation, someone with clear eyes and no stake in the outcome. But that was the practical answer. The real answer was something she wasn't entirely ready to say directly, so she said the version adjacent to it. "I needed to tell someone who wasn't going to tell me it was going to be fine." He looked at her without flinching. "It might not be fine," he said. "This is serious. Even if you catch him, there's going to be fallout. Board confidence, press, clients." He paused. "But you already know that. I know that. And you're going to do it anyway." He stole from a foundation meant to preserve neighborhoods where people have lived for 40 years. Her voice was flat and certain. "Yes, I'm going to do it anyway." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know someone. Former insurance investigator. He does financial forensics privately now. He's thorough and he's discreet and he doesn't bill for things he doesn't find. Can you trust him? He did the provenance work on a 1958 Ferrari I restored 2 years ago. The ownership chain had a 20-year gap that could have been fraud. He found the documentation in an estate archive in Turin. He looked at her steadily. Yeah, I trust him. She held his eyes for a moment. Send me his contact. I'll call him today and tell him to expect you. She nodded. She looked back at the document spread across the conference table, the paper record of something broken running beneath the surface of the thing she'd built, and felt the specific exhaustion that arrived not with the crisis itself, but with the understanding that the crisis had been there for a long time without her knowing. 4 years, she said, more to herself than to him. You didn't know, he said. I should have. Maybe. He didn't soften it with reassurance, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated the reassurance. But you know now. She looked up. That's the part that matters, he said. She thought about a man who looked at a damaged car and found the source of the problem rather than the symptom. She thought about what it cost him to do that for people who didn't always want to hear that the damage was more fundamental than they'd hoped. Thank you for coming, she said. I brought bad coffee, he said. It's the least I could do. She almost laughed. Genuinely, involuntarily, the way she laughed at the Stuttgart story. It is genuinely terrible, she said, nodding at his cup. It's consistent, he said. I respect consistency. She thought about that for the rest of the day, through 2 calls and a site review and a dinner she ate alone at her desk, picking at it while the city went dark outside the windows. Consistency. A man who knew what he was and stayed that way regardless of context, in a workshop, in a cafe, on a rainy afternoon with a sick child and a can of soup, in a 31st floor office with evidence of fraud spread across the conference table, the same person in every room. She was not sure if she was honest with herself that she could say the same. She had versions of herself that she deployed in different contexts, professional and personal, and the careful in-between she'd been navigating on Wednesdays. She had armor she wore so automatically, she sometimes forgot what was underneath it. Ethan Brooks had apparently never bothered to build the armor. She didn't know if that was brave or simply how some people were built. She thought it might be both. The next 10 days were the most controlled chaos she'd managed since the Savannah contractor dispute, except this time the stakes were significantly higher and the person causing the problem was someone she'd trusted with her company's financial infrastructure for 4 years. The forensic investigator, a compact, unhurried man named Dale Pritchard who wore reading glasses on a chain and asked questions with the patient thoroughness of someone who had learned not to be surprised by anything, spent 4 days with Margaret Chen going through 5 years of financial records. Scarlett's attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Vivian Park, who had the particular economy of movement of someone accustomed to courtrooms, reviewed the vendor contracts and the payment patterns and said, on the second day with no preamble, this is fraud, not ambiguous fraud, clear, documented, prosecutable fraud. How much? Scarlett asked. Vivian looked at Dale. Conservatively, $2.3 million over 4 years, Dale said. That's what we can prove with what we have. There may be more in areas we haven't fully reconstructed. $2.3 million. Extracted from her company in increments small enough to avoid automatic review, through shell structures sophisticated enough to require a Cayman attorney to set up, by a man who had sat across from her at budget reviews twice a year for 4 years and told her the numbers looked clean. She sat with that number for about 90 seconds. Then she said, what do we need to make the case airtight before I take it to the board? Because that was who she was. 90 seconds for the shock. Then back to work. Dale needed 3 more days. He got them. Vivian spent those 3 days building the legal documentation. Scarlett spent them continuing to act normally around Richard Vaughn, which was the hardest professional performance of her life, sitting in a Tuesday operational review and listening to him present third-quarter budget projections with the same practiced authority he always brought, the same controlled affect, the same easy command of numbers that she now understood had been used against her, and keeping her face exactly as it always was. She was very good at keeping her face exactly as it always was. She had not told anyone outside of Margaret, Vivian, and Dale. She had not told her board chair, her general counsel, or her communications team. She had told Ethan. Not the details. She was careful with those, but the outline. How the picture was becoming clearer. How the number was bigger than she'd first suspected. She told him on the phone, late, after Mia was in bed, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Are you okay? Not how bad is it, or what happens next? Just, are you okay?" She stood in her kitchen with the harbor visible through the window, dark and moving, and realized that nobody else had asked her that. Not because they didn't care, but because they were all inside the problem with her, looking at the numbers and the documents and the legal exposure, and not one of them had stepped back and looked at her. "I'm angry," she said. "Mostly I'm angry." That makes sense. He used the foundation. He used the Radcliffe Borough properties, the preservation work, the community trust we were building, as a vehicle for personal profit. She pressed her free hand flat on the counter. Those are real people. Mr. Tatum has lived in that neighborhood for 41 years. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't feel betrayed in the personal sense. I feel angry on behalf of what he tried to take." "That's not all you feel." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she admitted. "It's not all I feel. You trusted him." "I trusted his competence. I trusted his judgment with money." She thought about how to say the rest. "I don't know that I ever trusted him the way—" She stopped again. He didn't fill the silence. "The way I trust you," she said, quietly, plainly. "The way you say things in the dark when you're too tired to manage them into something safer." The pause on the other end of the line was careful and warm. "You'll get through this," he said. "The board meeting, the investigation, all of it. You know what you're doing." "I know," she exhaled. "Mia asleep?" Since 8:45, she negotiated an extra chapter of her book and then was out cold before I finished the page. "What book?" "Something about a girl who finds out her school is built on top of an ancient archive. It's surprisingly complicated for the target age group. She'll probably write a structural analysis of the archive by Thursday. Already has questions about load-bearing walls." A beat. "Apparently she knows someone who knows about that." Scarlett smiled at the harbor. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Scarlett." She stood at the window for another few minutes after hanging up, watching the lights of the harbor move, and felt something she hadn't felt in the middle of a crisis since she was young enough not to have learned to manage everything alone. The specific relief of not being entirely alone in it. It was 3 days before the board meeting when Richard moved. Scarlett was in the elevator heading up from a ground-floor vendor meeting when her assistant called. "Richard Vaughn just requested an emergency session with the board chair," her assistant said, in the careful tone that meant she had already understood this was significant and was waiting to be told what to do with that understanding. Scarlett stepped off the elevator on 29 instead of 31 and walked into an empty conference room and closed the door. "When?" "He's on the phone with Harrison Webb right now." Harrison Webb. The board chair, 63 years old, conservative, deeply invested in the company's reputation, and constitutionally incapable of sitting with ambiguity. If Richard got to him first with a narrative, the next 48 hours were going to be considerably more complicated. "Get me Vivian Park," Scarlett said, "and get me Harrison Webb's assistant. I need 30 minutes with Harrison today, this afternoon." "Richard already has him at 4. She looked at the conference room wall and thought very fast. Richard had moved because something had shifted. Either he'd noticed the forensic work somehow, or he'd seen that the Radcliffe Borough site engagement was progressing faster than he'd anticipated, or he'd simply made the calculation that the timeline was running out and a preemptive accusation was his best play. It was, she had to admit, not a stupid play. If he accused her first of misconduct, of misuse of foundation funds, of anything that created doubt, he could slow the investigation, fracture the board's confidence, and buy himself enough time to complicate the paper trail. He didn't need to win. He just needed to create enough noise that winning became harder for her. "Get me Harrison at 2, she said. "Tell his assistant it's about a compliance issue that requires his attention before end of day. Don't use Richard's name." "Yes." Her assistant paused. "Is there anything—" I'm fine, Scarlett said. Make the calls. She called Vivian next. He's moving, she said. I expected this, Vivian said, without any apparent disruption to her calm. How much time do we have? He's at 4 with Harrison. I'm at 2. You'll need the summary document and the payment evidence. I can have a clean package to you by 1:15. What about the Cayman structure? Do we have enough on that? We have enough to raise significant questions in front of a board. We don't have the final layer of ownership yet. That may take another 2 to 3 weeks. But Scarlett, Vivian's voice was precise. What we have now is enough. The pattern alone is enough. You don't need the last piece to establish that what Richard Vaughn has been doing is fraud. Scarlett stood in the empty conference room and looked at the wall and breathed. Okay, she said. 1:15. She called Margaret Chen. He's moving today, she said. Margaret was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I'll have the reconciled audit timeline on your desk in an hour. Thank you, Margaret. He sat in this office and told me the Q2 compliance review was clean, Margaret said. Her voice had a quality Scarlett had never heard in it before, not anger exactly, but the specific controlled fury of someone who takes precision seriously, discovering that their precision had been used as cover. He sat right there. I know. I want to be in that room, Scarlett, when you present this. You'll be there. She hung up and stood very still for a moment, then called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was somewhere accessible rather than deep in the workshop. He's moving today, she said. A pause. Before the board meeting. Yes, he's going to Harrison Webb at 4 to get to the board first with whatever version he's constructed. What are you going to do? I'm going to Harrison at 2 with everything we have. I'm going to put the full documentation in front of him and give him the truth before Richard can give him the story. She paused. It might not be enough. He's careful. He doesn't like surprises. If he feels ambushed by the information, he might table everything pending an independent review, which is exactly the delay Richard needs. Then don't ambush him, Ethan said. Tell him the truth the way you'd tell someone who needs to understand it, not the way you'd present it to win an argument. She stopped. You're not trying to beat Richard in that room, he said. You're trying to give Harrison a clear picture. Those are different goals. She thought about boardroom presentations, about how she had spent 15 years perfecting the architecture of persuasion, the sequencing, the framing, the way you led someone to the conclusion you needed them to reach. It was a skill she was genuinely excellent at, and it had served her well for a long time. And Ethan was right. It was the wrong tool for this room. Yes, she said. Okay. Call me after, he said. I will. She was in Harrison Webb's office at 2:03. Vivian was with her, and the document package, and 15 years of built institutional credibility that she was about to spend on telling an uncomfortable truth as plainly as she could manage. Harrison Webb was a tall man who had the permanent slight frown of someone who had spent decades worrying about the company's reputation. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and his face in the careful neutral of a man preparing himself. Scarlett sat down. She did not open the document package immediately. Harrison, she said, I'm going to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear, and I'm going to ask you to let me get through all of it before you respond. He looked at her. That's a concerning way to start. I know. She held his eyes. Richard Vaughn has been systematically defrauding this company for at least 4 years. We have documentation of $2.3 million in fraudulent vendor payments. We have a forensic accountant's analysis. We have a former federal prosecutor who will tell you, as she told me, that this is clear and prosecutable fraud. She paused. He's going to be in your office at 4 with a different story. I need you to have this one first. The silence in the room was significant. Harrison looked at Vivian, then back at Scarlett. I know what it is, Scarlett said. I've known for 10 days. Why didn't you come to me? Because I needed to be certain before I brought it to you. Because an accusation without documentation does more damage than the fraud itself to board confidence. And because I needed to know the shape of the whole thing before I could show it to you clearly. She set the document package on the desk and slid it across. Everything is in there. The payment trail, the shell company structure, the forensic analysis. Margaret Chen and Dale Pritchard can answer any technical questions. Vivian Park can address the legal questions. Harrison opened the package. He was quiet for a long time. He was still reading when his assistant's voice came through the intercom at 3:47, saying that Richard Vaughn had arrived early for his 4 o'clock. Harrison looked up from the documents. His face had gone through several stages in the last hour and 40 minutes, and had arrived somewhere that was not quite anger and not quite grief. The expression of a man who has been a careful steward of something for a long time, and has just understood that the thing was damaged in a place he hadn't been looking. "Tell him I'll be with him in 20 minutes, Harrison said. His assistant acknowledged and clicked off. Harrison Webb looked at Scarlett Hayes across a desk covered in 2 years of his careful stewardship. "You're certain," he said. Not a question, an assessment. "I'm certain of what the documents show," she said. "The documents don't leave room for interpretation." He nodded slowly. He looked at Vivian. "You'd take this to trial?" "Without hesitation," Vivian said. Harrison was quiet for another moment, then he said something Scarlett hadn't expected. "I saw something in Q3 last year, a variance in the operational budget that the reconciliation explained away." He looked at the table. "I should have pushed harder." "You trusted your EVP," Scarlett said. "That's what EVPs are for." "So did you." "Yes," she said. "I did." The silence between them was the honest kind. Two people sitting with the specific humility of having been careful and still being wrong and deciding what to do about it. "I'll handle the 4 o'clock, Harrison said finally. He closed the document package with both hands and set it deliberately in the center of his desk. "I'll need an emergency board session, Thursday morning." "I'll be ready," Scarlett said. She walked out of Harrison Webb's office at 4:02. In the hallway, she passed Richard Vaughn sitting in one of the reception chairs with the particular composed readiness of a man who believed he was about to win something. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. She met his eyes. She did not stop walking. She did not smile. She did not give him anything to read in her face because her face was exactly what it always was, controlled, direct, present. And in that moment, for the first time in this entire 10-day ordeal, she felt something clarify beneath the anger. Not triumph. Not yet. Something quieter than that. The specific clean feeling of having done things in the right order for the right reasons. The same feeling she'd had the first time she walked through the Beaufort property after the restoration was complete and the building had exhaled. She took the elevator down to the lobby, walked out into the October afternoon, sat in her car, and called Ethan. "Harrison has everything," she said. "Board meeting Thursday morning." How did it go? She thought about the right answer to that question. She looked at the street. A normal Charleston afternoon, people walking, a delivery truck blocking the right lane, two pigeons disputing ownership of something near a trash can. "I told the truth plainly," she said. "Like you said." "And?" "And Harrison believed me." She paused. "He said he'd seen something in Q3 last year and didn't push hard enough. He blamed himself." Ethan was quiet. "I told him he trusted the person he was supposed to trust," she said. "He said the same thing back to me." "Because it's true for both of you." "Yes." She watched the pigeons reach some kind of territorial settlement. "It doesn't make it feel better, but it's true." "No," he said. "It doesn't make it feel better." She appreciated that he didn't try to make it feel better. "Thursday morning," she said. "Board session. After that, we refer it to federal investigators, and it's out of my hands." She exhaled. "The foundation is intact. The Radcliffe Borough work continues. Those are the things that matter." "Yes," he said. "They are." A beat. "Mia wants to know if you're coming Wednesday," he said. "She has a question about load-bearing walls in 19th century construction that apparently only you can answer." Something released in Scarlett's chest. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just a small, quiet loosening of something that had been held tight for 10 days. "Tell her yes," she said. "She'll want that in writing." "She's 7. "She's very much 7, he agreed. Scarlett leaned her head briefly against the seat and looked at the ceiling of her car, thinking about a board meeting she wasn't afraid of anymore. and a Wednesday she was already looking forward to, and a man who had told her to say the truth plainly and had been right about what that would cost and what it would return. She started the car. She had work to do before Thursday. She did it. The Thursday board meeting lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Scarlett knew the exact duration because she'd been watching the clock above the boardroom door with the specific awareness of someone who has learned to track time not as a measure of progress, but as a measure of endurance. 3 hours and 14 minutes of presenting documentation, answering questions, watching 11 people she had worked alongside for years absorb the information that the company's financial infrastructure had been systematically compromised by a man 2 of them had personally recommended for the EVP position 6 years ago. Richard had come to the meeting. She hadn't expected that. His attorney had apparently advised him that absence would read worse than presence, and so he had arrived in his usual charcoal suit with his usual controlled affect, and sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his face arranged in the expression of a man preparing to dispute something he knew he couldn't actually dispute. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was careful and oblique. Words like context and mischaracterization and procedural irregularities that sounded like a defense and contained nothing that could be directly refuted because they contained nothing at all. Vivian Park sat beside Scarlett and did not raise her voice once in 3 hours and 14 minutes. She didn't need to. The document spoke at a volume that no one in the room could talk over. At the 2-hour and 50-minute mark, Harrison Webb asked Richard Vaughn directly, "Do you dispute the payment records as presented?" Richard looked at his attorney. His attorney said, "My client is not in a position to—" "I'm asking your client," Harrison said. He had the particular flatness in his voice of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has decided that patience has served its purpose. Richard looked at the table. The room was very quiet. "No," Richard said finally, "I don't dispute the records." What followed was not dramatic in the way boardroom confrontations were in films. No raised voices, no theatrical exits. It was quieter, and in some ways worse than that. It was 11 people around a table making a series of careful, necessary decisions in measured voices, while a man at the end of the table sat in the specific silence of someone who had run out of moves. The board voted to remove Richard Vaughn from his position, effective immediately. They voted to refer the matter to federal investigators. They voted to retain Vivian Park as outside counsel for the duration of the investigation. They voted to commission an independent audit of the preceding 5 years. All 11 votes were unanimous. Harrison Webb adjourned the session. People stood, gathered papers, exchanged the particular low-voiced exchanges that follow something significant, not the excited energy of a crisis, but the heavier, more tired energy of people who have had to do something hard and correct and are now going to have to live with the aftermath. Richard left with his attorney without speaking to anyone. Scarlett watched him go. She had expected to feel something more defined than what she actually felt, which was a complicated flatness, not satisfaction, not relief, not the clean completion she'd felt walking out of Harrison's office on Tuesday. Something more mixed. The specific deflation that comes after a fight you were right to have, but didn't want to have, when the adrenaline clears and leaves behind just the fact of it. Margaret Chen appeared at her elbow as the room emptied. "It's done," Margaret said. "It's referred," Scarlett said. "It's not done. There's the federal investigation, the independent audit, the press when this becomes public." She picked up her document folder. "The next 3 months are going to be—" "I know," Margaret said, "but the company is intact. The foundation is intact." She paused. "You're intact." Scarlett looked at her. Margaret Chen, who had been with her for 8 years, who had flagged a compliance issue on her own initiative and never asked for anything beyond a straightforward accounting of how things were, who had spent 10 days reviewing 5 years of records with a forensic accountant without complaint or self-promotion. "Thank you, Margaret," she said, "for all of it." Margaret nodded once, which was Margaret's version of "you're welcome," and left. Scarlett stood alone in the boardroom for a moment. The harbor was visible through the windows. That same view she'd stopped noticing, which she was apparently now noticing again. The light was flat and white, the kind of overcast November morning that made Charleston look like a watercolor left in the rain. She picked up her phone. She texted Ethan, "It's done. Board voted unanimous, federal referral made." 3 minutes passed. Then, Good. Come by the workshop if you want. Mia's at school, but there's coffee. She almost texted back that she had 17 things to handle. She almost wrote a list of them in her head to justify staying at her desk. She went to the workshop instead. He didn't make a production of it when she arrived. He was in the middle of the Ferrari dyno's paint preparation, the careful, precise work of surface correction before primer. And he kept working while she sat on the stool by the workbench and told him what the meeting had been like. He listened with the focused half-attention of someone whose hands are occupied but whose mind is fully present, which she had come to understand was not inattention, but actually the opposite of it. The way some people think better when their body has something to do. He admitted it in the room, she said. Not directly, but he didn't dispute the records. What did that feel like? She thought about it honestly. Less than I expected. I thought I'd feel something clear. Anger completing itself, maybe. Instead, it just felt heavy. Because it's not actually finished, he said. The vote was finished. The thing isn't finished. No, she said. It isn't. He put down the applicator and looked at her. How are you actually doing? I keep thinking about the 4 years, she said. The budget reviews, the planning meetings. Every time I asked him for a number and he gave me one, I was making decisions based on information he'd already contaminated. She pressed her hands flat on the workbench. I built the foundation's financial model partly on his projections. I want to go back through everything with Margaret and rebuild it from scratch with clean data, but part of me just wants to burn the projections entirely and start from... She stopped. I don't mean that literally. I know you don't. He was quiet for a moment. When I took over a restoration last year from a shop that had done preliminary work, they'd used a filler on a body panel instead of replacing the metal. They'd covered it, primed over it, made it look complete. I had to strip everything back to the steel and start over. He paused. That's not failure. That's finding the actual starting line. She looked at him. You're at the actual starting line now, he said. Everything before this was built on a filler someone else put there. She sat with that for a moment. The workshop was quiet around them except for the music. Always music, always old, this week something with a woman's voice and a piano that moved slowly. You do that? She said. What? Find the right metaphor, the structural thing, the car thing. She met his eyes. You make the technical thing carry something true. He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he looked when she said something that went past the practical level he was comfortable operating on. I just talk about what I know, he said. I know, she said. That's what makes it work. The days after the board meeting were exactly what she'd predicted, and slightly worse. The federal investigation opened formally within a week. The independent audit began. The press got hold of the story through a source she never identified. Not a leak from her side, Vivian confirmed, which meant Richard's attorney had made the calculation that a controlled public narrative served his client better than silence. And for 3 days, the coverage was the specific kind of aggressive and half-informed that business journalism produced when it had real material to work with, but incomplete context. Scarlett did one interview. Not with the publication that broke the story, but with a financial reporter she'd known for 6 years, who she trusted to present the material without embellishment. She said what was true. The company had identified internal fraud, had acted immediately and transparently, and was cooperating fully with federal investigators. She did not editorialize. She did not perform devastation or manufactured resilience. She stated the facts in the order they had occurred and answered 4 follow-up questions and declined to comment on Richard Vaughn's personal culpability, which was Vivian's strong advice and her own preference. The coverage stabilized after the interview. Not disappeared, but it didn't disappear. It was too good a story for that. But stabilized into the factual reporting that was manageable rather than the speculative kind that wasn't. 3 of her board members called to say she'd handled it well. 1 called to express concern about optics. She thanked all 4 of them and moved on. What she didn't expect was what happened internally, in the space that the crisis had occupied for nearly 3 weeks. When the immediate emergency cleared, when the federal referral was made and the audit was underway and the press cycle had moved on to the next thing, she found herself in her office on a Thursday afternoon with nothing urgent in front of her for the first time in recent memory, and instead of the relief she'd expected, she felt something stranger. She felt the question that had been waiting patiently underneath the fraud investigation and the board meeting and the 10 days of controlled crisis management, the question she'd been too busy to look at directly. What now? Not what now for the company. She knew what now for the company. Audit, recovery, restructure the finance oversight, hire a new EVP with a different screening process. Those were problems with solutions. What now for her? She sat in her office and looked at the harbor. She was looking at it again regularly, she'd noticed, and thought about something she'd said to Ethan on the third Wednesday, when she'd spread the Radcliffe Borough blueprints on his workbench, and he'd asked why she'd brought them to him. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. She'd said it about having children, but it was true about several things. She hadn't figured out what she was building toward. She'd been so focused on building. The company, the foundation, the quarterly projections, and the acquisition strategy and the restoration plans, that she'd stopped asking what the building was for. The Beaufort Hotel had felt like something that mattered to the people inside it, she'd told Ethan, not just to the quarterly report. She sat with that for a while. Then she called her mother. This was not a small thing. Calling her mother voluntarily in the middle of the workday was not behavior Scarlett Hayes exhibited regularly. Her mother, to her credit, didn't comment on this. She just said Scarlett, in the warm way that meant she'd been waiting, and listened. I want to talk about the foundation, Scarlett said, about what I actually want it to be. Okay, her mother said. I'm listening. I started it because I believed in historic preservation, and I had the resources to do something real. That's still true. She turned her chair to face the window. But I've been running it like a division of the company. Project management, financial modeling, board structure, the way I run everything. And I went to Radcliffe Borough last month to meet a man named Mr. Tatum, who has lived in the same house for 41 years. He has a fig tree in the back that his wife planted in 1987. He told me about it because I asked what the neighborhood meant to him, and the tree was the first thing he mentioned. She paused. I've been building a foundation around preservation, and I hadn't actually asked the people whose neighborhood I was preserving what they most wanted preserved. Her mother was quiet for a moment. That's important, Scarlett. I know. She exhaled. I want to restructure how the foundation works. I want community input at the design level, not the approval level. I want the people who live in these neighborhoods to help decide what restoration means for their specific block, not just ratify what my team has already decided is historically appropriate. She stopped. It's more complicated operationally. It takes longer. The outcomes are less predictable. But it's the right thing, her mother said. Yes. A pause. Does this have anything to do with Ethan Brooks? Her mother said. Scarlett almost said no. It has something to do with having spent time with someone who knows what it looks like to do something right versus close enough, she said instead, and what it costs to hold that line. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a comment. It was the sound of a woman who had arranged a blind date and was watching something unfold that was better than what she'd hoped for and had the wisdom not to say so directly. Tell me more about the foundation restructure, her mother said. They talked for 45 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than their typical calls. When Scarlett hung up, she felt something she hadn't felt after a phone call with her mother in years. Lighter. Not because the problems were solved, but because she'd said the real thing out loud to someone who knew her, and it had sounded like a direction rather than a complaint. She started writing the restructure proposal that afternoon. She worked on it through the weekend, which was unusual because she typically kept weekends at least partially protected for the kind of nothing that prevented her from burning out. But this didn't feel like work in the way the quarterly reports felt like work. It felt more like the Beaufort Hotel, like building something that mattered for a reason she actually believed. On Sunday, she drove to Radcliffe Borough and spent 3 hours walking the neighborhood with a notepad and no agenda. She looked at buildings. She talked to people who were outside. A woman hanging laundry, 2 men drinking coffee on a stoop, a teenager shooting baskets in a narrow side yard. She asked what they wanted to keep and what they wanted to change and what they'd lost already and what they were afraid of losing. She wrote everything down, not as data, as testimony. She brought the notepad to the workshop on Wednesday. Ethan looked at it when she set it on the workbench. What's this? The actual starting line, she said. He picked it up and read for a few minutes. She watched his face. He read slowly and carefully, the way he read everything. Like the words deserved his full attention regardless of what they were. "The woman with the laundry," he said when he set it down. "Mrs. Gadsden. She mentioned the wrought iron on the second-floor gallery. It's original 1880s ironwork. The structural assessment flagged it as a low priority because it's not load-bearing. But to her, it's the thing that makes the building look like her building, not anyone else's." Scarlett looked at the notepad. "I've been making preservation decisions based on structural and historical significance. Those are real criteria, but they're not the only criteria." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're going to rebuild the whole foundation model. The community engagement model, the rest stays." She paused. "It's going to take time, and it's going to mean having conversations with people who've had bad experiences with developers, including, probably, developers who've done work adjacent to mine, and convincing them that this is different." "Is it different?" She looked at him. "It's going to be." He held her eyes for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." It was Mia who pushed things forward, though she didn't know she was doing it and would have considered the entire adult situation excessively complicated if she had. She arrived at the workshop on a Saturday, the first Saturday Scarlett had come, stepping outside the Wednesday structure because Ethan had mentioned the Ferrari dyno was reaching the paint stage and Mia had told him to invite Scarlett, apparently without being asked to do so, and she came through the bay door with a rolled-up paper under her arm and the specific energy of someone carrying news. "I made a drawing," she announced. "Of what?" Ethan said from under the Ferrari. "The Radcliffe Borough project." She looked at Scarlett. "I looked it up. I drew what I think some of the buildings should look like when they're finished, based on the photographs." She unrolled the paper on the workbench. It was detailed in the way Mia's things were detailed. Not artistically perfect, but carefully observed. She'd drawn 3 buildings in a row, clearly referencing specific structures Scarlett recognized from the site. She'd included the wrought iron gallery on the second floor of the middle building. In the front yard of the rightmost one, she'd drawn what was clearly meant to be a fig tree, disproportionately large, with a round smiling figure underneath it. Scarlett stood at the workbench looking at this drawing for long enough that Ethan came out from under the car to see what was happening. He looked at the drawing, then at Scarlett. Her expression was doing something that was not quite composed. The fig tree, the round smiling figure. A 7-year-old who had listened to the foundation conversation from 3 weeks ago and gone home and drawn a picture of Mr. Tatum under his wife's fig tree without being asked, without knowing the weight that image carried, because it was simply what she'd understood the point to be. "Mia," Scarlett said, and her voice was not quite what it normally was. "This is really good." Mia looked satisfied in a way that was not entirely about the compliment. "I thought you could show it at the community meetings," she said, "so people know what it's going to look like." "I think I could do that," Scarlett said. "It's not perfect," Mia said, with the honesty of a person who knows the difference between what they made and what they envisioned. "The proportions on the middle building are a little off, but I didn't have the real measurements." "I can get you the real measurements," Scarlett said. Mia looked at her. "Really?" "If you want to do a more accurate version." Mia turned to her father. "Can I?" Ethan was looking at Scarlett with the expression she'd cataloged and not named, the one that appeared when Mia said something that cut past his defenses. Except this time it wasn't prompted by Mia alone. It was the specific combination of the drawing and the fig tree and Scarlett's almost undone face and the realization of what his daughter had understood without being told. "Yeah," he said to Mia. "You can." The 3 of them ate lunch in the office with the mismatched chairs and the crayon drawing on the filing cabinet. Mia had requested specific sandwiches, turkey and no mustard, which she reported Ethan always forgot, and Ethan had in fact forgotten the mustard situation and was defensive about it in a way that suggested this was a recurring operational failure. "I told you last time," Mia said. "I remembered last time. This time I forgot." "That's called inconsistent." "That's called human," Ethan said. Mia looked at Scarlett for adjudication. "I think both of you have valid points," Scarlett said, which was the answer she gave when she was genuinely amused and didn't want to take sides. "That's a politician answer," Mia said.
It is, Scarlett agreed. I've been in a lot of meetings lately. Mia ate around the edge of her sandwich with the systematic approach of someone who had priorities about crust. Are you going to keep coming on Wednesdays? She asked, not looking up. The studied casualness of a child asking something they actually care about. Ethan said, Mia, it's a relevant question, Mia said. I'm doing a longer project. I need to know if Scarlett is going to be available for consulting. I am available for consulting, Scarlett said. And yes, I'm going to keep coming on Wednesdays.
Mia nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. Good, she said, because I told my teacher my family friend is a CEO and she wants me to write about it for Career Week. The word family landed in the room without drama, without apparent awareness of its own weight. Mia had used it the way she used all words, as an accurate descriptor of what she observed to be true, and moved immediately back to her sandwich. Ethan was very still for a moment. Scarlett did not look at him. She looked at Mia's drawing, still rolled out on the desk, and the round, smiling figure under the large fig tree, and felt the words settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. Tell your teacher I'm happy to talk to the class if that would help, she said to Mia. She'll probably say yes, Mia said. She likes real people better than videos. Real people are generally more useful, Scarlett agreed. After lunch, Mia went back to the workshop floor, apparently to consult the Ferrari dyno on some independent question she'd been developing, and Ethan and Scarlett were alone in the office with the debris of 3 sandwiches and the drawing still on the desk. She didn't mean anything by the family thing, Ethan said. He was clearing the wrappers, not looking at her. She says what she thinks. I know, Scarlett said. She gets attached, he said. She does it fast and completely. She always has. He stopped clearing. He put both hands on the desk and looked at the drawing. I don't want her to get hurt. The room was very quiet. Scarlett understood what he was actually saying. Not the protective father version, though that was real too. The other version. The version that was about a man who had learned, in the hardest possible way, the cost of getting attached fast and completely, and who had spent 5 years building something careful and good out of what was left, and who was now standing in the office he'd built with a woman he hadn't planned on and a daughter who used the word family, like it was already obvious, and was telling her the truth about what was at stake. She stood up. She walked to the desk, not beside him but across from him, so they were facing each other with the drawing between them. I know what she means to you, she said. I'm not going to be careless with that. He looked at her, the direct, settled attention. I know you're not, he said. That's not... I know that about you. Then what are you telling me? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office door, they could hear Mia saying something to the Ferrari Dino in the particular tone of one-sided conversation that suggested she'd found a new question. I'm telling you that I'm in this, he said. That I've been in this since you came back the second time with blueprints and bad clay on your shirt. That I was probably in it before that, if I'm honest. He looked at the drawing. I'm telling you that because I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't start things I don't intend to finish, and I needed you to know where I am before, I don't know. Before it becomes something I should have said earlier. Scarlett looked at him across the desk, across the drawing of the 3-row houses, and the iron gallery and the fig tree, and felt the thing she'd been carefully not naming for 3 months complete itself into a shape she could actually see. She was in this too. She had been for a while. She'd known it the afternoon she stood at the doorway in the rain and drove home thinking about a sleeping child's feet in her lap. She'd known it when she called him before the board meeting instead of her attorney. She'd known it on the phone in the dark when she said someone I trust and heard him take that seriously. She just hadn't said it yet. I know where I am too, she said. I've known for a while. He looked at her. I'm also not careless, she said, with things that matter. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, just the settling of something that had been held at a slight tension, releasing into the posture of someone who no longer needs to brace. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. From the workshop, Mia's voice. Dad, the Dino's color is wrong. I looked it up and it should be Dino Rosso, not Rosso Corsa. They're different. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. She's right, he said quietly. The client wanted a variation, and I haven't updated the documentation. You should probably go deal with that. I probably should. He picked up the sandwich wrappers, stopped, looked at her. Dinner, next week. Not a Wednesday, not a workshop. Somewhere with actual tables and food that doesn't come in wax paper. He said it the way he said everything, like directly, without performance. You, me, and probably Mia, who will negotiate her way into it regardless of what I decide. Scarlett felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A simple, uncomplicated wanting, not tangled with logistics or expectations or the particular protective irony she used to keep things at a manageable distance. Yes, she said. Dad, Mia called. I'm documenting the discrepancy. You need to sign off on my note. She's making him sign documentation, Scarlett said. She makes me sign everything, Ethan said, and walked toward the door. Then stopped. Turned back. She learned the documentation thing from watching me. I have nobody to blame. You built something excellent, Scarlett said. You shouldn't blame yourself. He looked at her with the small, genuine version of the smile, not the cafe version, not the polite version, the real one, and walked back into the workshop. Scarlett stood for a moment in the office with the mismatched chairs and the crayon drawing on the filing cabinet and Mia's careful rendering of the Radcliffe Borough building spread on the desk and the fig tree with the smiling figure underneath it, and she thought about real starting lines and the actual cost of doing things right, and what it felt like to be in a room where the things that mattered were treated like they mattered. She thought she might be, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. She picked up the drawing carefully and rolled it back up. She was going to frame it. She didn't tell anyone that yet. But she was going to frame it and hang it in her office on the 31st floor, between the window that looked at the harbor she'd stopped seeing and the conference table where she'd spread evidence of betrayal 10 days ago. And it was going to be the first thing she saw every morning when she walked in. A 7-year-old's drawing of what preservation meant to someone who understood it instinctively. A fig tree. A smiling figure. The actual point. The dinner Ethan had proposed, somewhere with actual tables, he'd said, not wax paper, turned out to be a place on Broad Street that his sister had recommended 3 years ago, and that he'd never actually gone to because, he admitted over the phone when they were confirming the details, he didn't go to restaurants much unless Mia was negotiating the destination. She picked this one too, didn't she? Scarlett said. A pause. She had opinions about the menu. Of course she did. Mia had in fact researched the restaurant with the systematic thoroughness she applied to break diagrams and historical preservation drawings, and had presented Ethan with a summary that included the pasta options, the noise level based on online reviews, and the information that the building dated to 1887, which she noted was relevant given current company interests. Ethan had relayed this to Scarlett with the tone of a man who had accepted that his 7-year-old was going to be a more effective project manager than most adults he'd encountered. The dinner was not perfect. Mia spilled water reaching for the breadbasket and spent several minutes in the particular distress of someone who takes competence personally. The service was slower than it should have been. Ethan ordered the wrong thing and ate it anyway without complaint, which Scarlett noticed and said nothing about but filed. They talked too long and were the second-to-last table in the restaurant when they finally left, with Mia asleep against Ethan's shoulder by the time they reached the car, her annotated menu folded in her jacket pocket. Standing on the sidewalk on Broad Street in the December air, while Ethan settled Mia into the back seat, Scarlett thought, this is what it actually looks like. Not the orchestrated version, not the version that gets described to people later, with the difficult parts smoothed over. Spilled water and slow service, and a child who falls asleep mid-sentence, and a man who eats the wrong thing without making it anyone's problem. This is what it looks like when it's real. She found she preferred it enormously to the other kind. Ethan closed the car door gently and straightened and looked at her across the roof of the truck in the cold December air. Next time I'll order the right thing, he said. The pasta was fine, she said. It wasn't what I wanted. Then next time order what you want. He looked at her with the small, real smile. Yeah, he said, I will. She drove home through streets that were strung with the low white lights the city put up in December, and she felt something she'd been feeling with increasing frequency over the past weeks,
a quality of being present in her own life that she'd lost somewhere in the accumulation of quarterly targets and board presentations and the particular loneliness of being very competent at managing everything alone. She'd been so good at being alone that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. The next 3 months were the most complicated and the most alive she could remember in years. And the two things were not unrelated. The federal investigation into Richard Vaughn moved at the methodical pace of federal investigations. Slower than Scarlett wanted, more thorough than she'd hoped, and ultimately more complete than she'd expected. By February, the investigators had traced the Cayman Holding Company to a real estate developer in Atlanta who had been colluding with Richard to acquire properties in historic neighborhoods across 3 southeastern cities before preservation foundations could establish community interest. The scheme was broader than Scarlett had found. The total fraud across all the ventures Richard had his hands in exceeded $4 million. Richard Vaughn was indicted in February on 7 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of money laundering. He posted bail and was awaiting trial. Scarlett was called to give a deposition in March, which she gave for 3 hours in Vivian Park's conference room with the flat, precise clarity she brought to board presentations, and which Vivian later said was the cleanest deposition she'd seen from a non-attorney witness in 12 years of practice. The independent audit of Hayes Hospitality's 5-year financials found no additional fraud beyond what Dale Pritchard had already identified. It did find 3 compliance gaps in the vendor approval process that Scarlett moved immediately to close, restructuring the Financial Oversight Committee and elevating Margaret Chen to an expanded role that gave her direct board reporting authority on compliance matters. Margaret accepted this without ceremony and immediately proposed 2 additional procedural improvements that Scarlett approved on the same call. The press coverage cycled through its predictable stages. The initial story, the indictment, the follow-up profiles that were mostly interested in how a company this size had sustained fraud for 4 years without catching it, which was a fair question that Scarlett answered honestly when asked, and without defensive posturing, because the honest answer was also the accurate one. She had trusted the wrong person with the wrong level of unsupervised authority, and she had changed the structure to prevent it. That was the story. She didn't need a better one. What surprised her was that the honest answer landed better than a crafted one would have. 3 clients who had been considering pulling business during the uncertainty of the investigation called in February to say they were renewing. 2 new hotel development partnerships reached out in March. Harrison Webb told her at the quarterly board meeting that the company's institutional credibility had, counterintuitively, improved in the aftermath of how the fraud had been handled. "People trust organizations that handle problems honestly," he said. "I know," she said. "I just didn't expect it to be this visible." "You should have," he said, not unkindly. "It's what you'd respect in someone else." She thought about that on the drive back from the board meeting. She thought about Ethan turning down Forbes' 400 clients because the work wasn't right. She thought about the way he said what he meant without architecture around it. She thought about the specific consistency of a person who was the same in every room, and what that consistency communicated to everyone who encountered it over time. She had always respected that in him. She hadn't fully understood that she was capable of it herself. The Radcliffe Borough project moved forward with the restructured community engagement model. It was slower than the original timeline, significantly slower, because building real community input into the design process meant having conversations that took time and produced outcomes that couldn't be entirely predicted in advance. Her development team was adjusting to a process that was less linear than what they were used to, and 2 of them had raised concerns about timeline and cost that were legitimate and that Scarlett had addressed directly. Yes, it will take longer. Yes, it will cost more in the planning phase. No, that's not a reason to not do it. She brought Ethan to one of the community meetings in January, not as a consultant, not with any formal role. She brought him because Mr. Tatum's neighbor had asked at the previous meeting whether anyone on the foundation team understood what it actually cost to rebuild something old correctly, and Scarlett had said she knew someone who did. He sat in the back of the community room at the Radcliffe Borough Neighborhood Center, a converted Victorian that needed its own restoration, which everyone in the room was aware of. And when the question came up about the ironwork on the gallery buildings, he answered it the way he answered everything, specifically, practically, without condescension,
with the precision of someone who had spent years knowing the difference between what was right and what was close enough. An older man named Mr. Beaumont, who had been skeptical of the foundation in the previous 2 meetings and had said so directly, asked him afterward how he knew about wrought iron fabrication. "I work with old things for a living," Ethan said. "The principles are the same. If it's worth preserving, you learn what it's made of." Mr. Beaumont looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way of someone who has decided to extend provisional credibility. "The man knows what he's talking about," he told Scarlett, as if she'd needed confirmation. "I know," she said. "Then listen to him," Mr. Beaumont said, and walked away. She did not tell Ethan that exchange. She didn't need to. The groundbreaking for the first Radcliffe Borough restoration phase happened on a Thursday morning in late March, when the weather was the specific kind of early spring that made Charleston look like someone had adjusted the saturation up 3 degrees. Pale green on everything, the Confederate jasmine just starting on the fences, the air carrying the particular mix of tidal salt and something flowering that Scarlett associated with being somewhere worth being. Mr. Tatum was there. He wore a good hat and stood in front of the building that had been his neighbor's for 4 decades and watched the ceremonial groundbreaking with the expression of someone who has waited long enough for something to trust that it was happening and hasn't entirely relaxed into that trust yet. Scarlett shook his hand before the ceremony. He held hers for a moment and said, "You came back and listened." "You told me what mattered," she said. "A lot of people came and asked. You were the first one who wrote it down and changed what you were doing because of it." He released her hand. "That's different." She stood at the podium and said things she'd written and things she hadn't planned to say, and the combination was better than the prepared version alone. She talked about the difference between preservation as a technical achievement and preservation as an act of community faith. She talked about a fig tree. She didn't name Mr. Tatum by name, but she'd asked first, and he'd said he preferred the tree to the attribution. But the people in the room who lived in the neighborhood knew exactly which tree she meant, and a few of them turned to look at him, and he stood with his good hat on and a contained expression that was probably what his version of moved looked like. Ethan was there, standing to the side with Mia, who had taken the morning off school because Scarlett had asked if she could come, and Ethan had made the executive decision that some things were more educational than a Thursday morning in 2nd grade. Mia was holding a program from the ceremony and writing something on the back of it, which could have been notes or could have been a structural assessment. Either was likely. When Scarlett stepped away from the podium, Mia looked up from the program and said, "You said the thing about the fig tree." "I did." "I thought you might." She went back to writing. "I wrote it down, for the record." "What record?" "The one I'm keeping," Mia said, with the calm certainty of someone who had decided to document something important and saw no need to elaborate. Ethan caught Scarlett's eye over Mia's head. The expression on his face was the one she'd first catalogued and not named and had now been living with long enough to read clearly. The particular combination of undone and present that was how he looked when something went past his careful exterior and he wasn't trying to stop it. She held his eyes for a moment. Then someone came to speak to her about the timeline, and she moved back into the work of the morning. It was 6 weeks after the groundbreaking when Mia asked the question that neither adult had asked each other yet, because some things need a 7-year-old to name them before anyone else will. They were at Ethan's apartment on a Saturday afternoon in May. Scarlett had been coming to the apartment with increasing regularity. Not just the workshop, the apartment too, the actual space where they lived, with Mia's drawings on the refrigerator and the books stacked sideways on the shelf because there was no more room and the specific lived-in quality of a home that was used hard and loved honestly. She'd learned where the good mugs were. She knew that the third cabinet from the left in the kitchen was where the coffee lived, and that Ethan made it too strong by most standards and exactly right by hers, and that Mia took hers with approximately 40% milk and would negotiate upward if not monitored. She'd brought groceries that afternoon because she'd been at the market and Ethan had mentioned that morning in a text about an unrelated logistical matter that the refrigerator was in a state. She'd bought things without much deliberate thought. The specific items that lived in that kitchen, not her kitchen, the things Mia liked and Ethan forgot to buy. and she'd stood in the checkout line and registered this without drama and moved on. They were making dinner together, which had become a thing that happened on Saturday afternoons with the ease of something that has found its own groove. Ethan was handling the part that required precision. He was, it turned out, a careful cook, the same quality of attention to process that he brought to restoration work. And Scarlett was handling everything else, which was a division of labor they'd arrived at through trial and not much error, because Scarlett was honest about her limitations in a kitchen, and Ethan was too practical to argue with honesty. Mia was at the kitchen table doing homework that she had explained was not due until Tuesday, but which she preferred to complete on Saturday so that Sunday could be used for activities she considered more productive. And she was eating an apple in the systematic way she ate things, working around the core in a precise spiral. And she looked up from her math worksheet and said, "Are you going to live with us?" The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan put down the pan. Scarlett, who was slicing bread at the counter, stopped slicing. Mia waited with the patience of someone who has asked a practical question and sees no reason it should be complicated. "That's, Ethan started. "It's a logistical question," Mia said. "You both work better when you're in the same place, and Scarlett knows where the coffee is." She looked at her apple. "And I think she should be here more." Ethan was quiet. Scarlett set down the bread knife and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Mia for a moment. She thought about the 11 minutes in a cafe 7 months ago. She thought about a parking lot full of hypercars she hadn't noticed because she'd already made up her mind. She thought about a wrench handed to a stranger and a lopsided braid and ginger ale at the pharmacy and bad coffee, drunk without complaint, and a man who said exactly what he meant, and a child who had apparently decided months ago how this should go and had been waiting, with remarkable patience for a 7-year-old, for the adults to catch up. "I don't know yet," Scarlett said, "but I think about it." Mia processed this. "That's not a no," she said. "It's not a no." Mia looked at her father. Ethan looked at Scarlett. "It's not a no," he said, in the specific quiet of someone saying something true and knowing it. Mia nodded and returned to her math worksheet with the air of someone who has received sufficient information and can now proceed with reasonable confidence. "Okay," she said. "I'll calculate the sleeping situation later." "You'll—" Ethan looked at the ceiling briefly. "Don't calculate the sleeping situation." "I already have preliminary notes," Mia said. Scarlett turned back to the bread so that neither of them could see her face, which was doing something she couldn't control and didn't want to manage into something more composed. She was, she realized, happy. Not the performed version, not the version that appeared in photographs at company events. The inconvenient, full-bodied kind, present and a little terrifying and stubbornly real in a way that didn't require anyone else's validation. It had been a long time since she'd let herself be simply happy, without immediately wondering what it was going to cost. The opening of the Radcliffe Borough District restoration happened on a Saturday in late May, when spring had settled properly into the city and the streets of the historic neighborhood looked the way they'd looked in the old photographs Scarlett had framed in the foundation's office. Iron galleries and narrow yards, and the specific quality of light that came through mature trees onto 19th century brick. It was not a gala. She'd made that decision early and held it against some pressure from the board's communications committee, who felt a larger event would generate better press coverage. She'd said no with the same flat certainty she'd said no to the contractor in Savannah. This was a neighborhood celebration, not a launch event. The people who mattered most were the ones who lived there, and the event should feel like it belonged to them. There were chairs set up on the block where the first restored building stood. There was food, local, real, contributed by restaurants and families from the neighborhood itself. There was music from a 3-piece band that Mr. Beaumont had recommended, and whose name Scarlett could not remember but whose sound was exactly right. There were children running on the newly restored brick sidewalk, and older residents sitting in the afternoon light, and the particular quality of ease that exists in a place where people feel at home. Mr. Tatum was there. His fig tree, visible from the street through the restored side gate of his property, had been carefully worked around during the foundation work at his specific and documented request. It stood in the afternoon light exactly as it had stood for 37 years, unchanged, continuous, present, He found Scarlett near the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the light was going amber. He had his good hat on again. "It looks like the neighborhood," he said. "That was the goal," she said. "People's goal isn't always the same as what they do." He looked at the restored buildings. "Yours was." "I want you to know I see that." She didn't have the right words for what that landed like, so she just said, "Thank you for trusting us with it." He nodded. Looked at Ethan, who was nearby talking to Mr. Beaumont with the ease of two people who had found they were interested in the same things. Looked at Mia, who was sitting on the restored front steps of the middle building, eating something and making notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere now, which she had explained to Scarlett was a documentation practice she'd adopted from observing both adults in her life. "Good man," Mr. Tatum said, nodding toward Ethan. "Yes," Scarlett said. "Knows what things are worth." He put his hat back straight. "That's rarer than people think." He walked back to his house, and Scarlett stood in the afternoon light of the street her foundation had worked to restore and felt the specific satisfaction that she'd been chasing, without fully knowing she was chasing it, since the night she'd stood in the Beaufort Hotel and felt the building exhale. Not completion. She'd learned enough by now to know that the feeling of completion was usually just the feeling of one thing ending so another could begin. But rightness, the feeling of being in the right work for the right reasons. After the ceremony, after the crowd had dispersed and the chairs were being folded and the band was packing their instruments, Ethan suggested they go back to Magnolia and Maine. He said it simply, the way he said everything, not with theatrical significance, just, "You want to go back to the cafe? The three of us." Mia, who had been listening, said yes before Scarlett could answer. They drove the 10 minutes to the cafe in Ethan's truck, Scarlett in the middle, Mia at the window with her notebook open, Ethan's hand on the gear shift where it sometimes found hers without anyone making a decision about it, and parked on the same block where 7 months ago 3 hypercars had sat in the afternoon sun unnoticed by a woman who had already made up her mind. Today there was just the old pickup truck. Ethan had brought the Dino to its owner in Atlanta last month, delivered personally, the way he delivered everything, driving it there and staying to walk the owner through the documentation of every decision made in 18 months of work. The owner had, Ethan mentioned, also cried. The cafe was quieter on a Saturday evening than it had been on the afternoon of the blind date. The same ceiling fans, the same heart pine floors, the same smell of roasted coffee and whatever was sweet in the back. They took the corner table by the window, not the same table exactly, that one was occupied, and ordered coffee and a piece of pie for Mia, who had negotiated this during the drive. Mia ate her pie with the focused appreciation of someone who takes dessert seriously and pulled out her notebook and continued whatever she was working on with one hand while eating with the other, which was a skill that Scarlett had observed developing over the past months and no longer found surprising. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, the way he always did, and looked at the cafe around them, and then at Scarlett. 7 months, he said. 7 months? 3 weeks, she said. Approximately. You remember the date? I remember being wrong about something significant. It tends to stick. He looked at her steadily. You weren't entirely wrong, he said. You were wrong about what you were looking at, not about the fact that it didn't look like it fit. It doesn't fit, she said. On paper, it still doesn't fit. No, he agreed. It doesn't. I keep thinking about that, she said. About the version of me who walked out of here and didn't look back. That version was being perfectly rational. She had a system for making decisions quickly, and she applied it. She looked at the table. She would have been fine. She would have kept building the company and running the foundation and managing everything alone and being very competent about all of it. Yeah, he said. She would have. But fine and right are different things. He looked at her. They are. I've been thinking about what I actually want, she said. Not what makes sense on paper. Not what fits the version of my life I'd already designed. She looked at him directly. I want this. The workshops and the bad coffee and Mia's structural assessments and the dinners where someone orders the wrong thing. I want the Wednesday conversations and the Saturday afternoons and I want the specific, inconvenient, real version of this. She paused. That's not something I've said to anyone before.
The cafe was quiet around them. Mia had stopped writing and was very still, which meant she was listening and had made a decision not to be visibly listening, which was not quite the same thing as not listening. Ethan looked at Scarlett across the corner table, and he said what he meant, which was what he always did. "I want that too," he'd said. "I've wanted it for longer than I told you." He turned the coffee cup. "When you left this place 7 months ago, I thought that was just who you were. Someone who makes a fast call and moves on." He paused. "Then you came back, and you kept coming back. And every time you did, you came back slightly more like yourself." She held very still. "What does that mean?" "It means the first Wednesday you were still managing the situation. By the third Wednesday you were just there." He met her eyes. "I like who you are when you're just there." She looked at him and thought about all the rooms she'd performed competence in, all the versions of herself she'd deployed at appropriate moments, all the careful architecture of a woman who had learned early that being fully present was a vulnerability she couldn't afford in most of the contexts her life produced. She thought about a workshop on a Sunday afternoon and a child with a rent she hadn't earned and bad coffee and blueprints on a workbench and a sick day on a couch and a doorway in a rainstorm and a drawing of a fig tree on a conference room desk. She thought about actually arriving, in the real sense, at a place she hadn't planned to be. "Mia," Ethan said, without looking away from Scarlett. "I'm not listening," Mia said immediately. "You're always listening." A pause. "I'm listening with good intentions," she amended. "Go get a refill on your hot chocolate," he said. "It's not empty." "Take your time," he said. Another pause, the sound of a chair scraping back.
Mia appeared at Scarlett's shoulder for a moment, close enough that Scarlett could see the notebook, which had on the current open page what appeared to be a floor plan of a 2-bedroom apartment with question marks in one of the rooms, and then moved toward the counter with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who understood they were being given a few minutes and was not going to waste them by rushing. Ethan leaned slightly forward across the table. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it without thinking about whether it fits anything." She felt the careful, full attention she'd learned to recognize as his version of completely present, no part of him somewhere else. "Okay," she said. "Are you happy? Not are we doing the right thing, or where is this going, or any of the questions that had architecture around them. Just the plain one. The one nobody in 7 months of business meetings and federal depositions and board presentations had asked her." She thought about the answer without managing it. "Yes," she said. "I'm actually happy." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." He reached across the table and she met him halfway, his hand over hers on the wooden table in the corner of the cafe where she'd walked out on him 7 months ago, and neither of them performed anything about it. There was no dramatics. His hand was rough from the work he did and warm from the coffee cup, and she felt the specific realness of it, the way you feel things when you've stopped bracing against them. They sat like that while the cafe moved quietly around them. Mia came back from the counter in approximately 90 seconds, which was not the time of someone who had taken their time and sat down and looked at the table and at their hands and opened her notebook to the floor plan page. "I updated the sleeping situation calculations," she said, in the tone of a briefing. "Mia," Ethan said. "They're preliminary," she said. "I'm not presenting them today. I'm just saying they exist." Scarlett looked at the floor plan over Mia's shoulder. The question marks in the second bedroom had been replaced with a small drawing of a desk and a chair and what appeared to be a stack of books. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "She researched you," he said quietly. "What you'd need in a space. She asked me what your office looked like." Scarlett looked at the small figure at the desk in the preliminary floor plan of a life that a 7-year-old had decided was already real enough to draw. "The desk in the drawing is too small," she said. "I have a lot of documents." Mia looked up immediately. "I can fix that." She reached for a pencil. "What size?" "Big enough for blueprints," Scarlett said. "And good coffee." Mia nodded seriously and began erasing the desk. Outside the cafe window, the May evening was settling into the blue hour. That particular quality of Charleston light that lingered long in late spring, turning everything soft and specific, the buildings on the block going amber and then blue and then something in between. Ethan's old pickup truck was parked where the Lamborghini and the McLaren and the Bugatti had been 7 months ago. It looked exactly like what it was, a working vehicle belonging to a man who used things for their actual purpose and kept them for a long time. Scarlett thought about the woman who had walked past those 3 hypercars 7 months ago and looked at her phone for her keys and almost missed the most important thing. She thought about the specific and expensive efficiency of deciding fast, moving on, keeping the calendar full and the exposure limited and the armor intact. She had built something real with those habits. She had also, without knowing it, been building walls around the parts of her life that needed air. What she had learned, not from a book or a boardroom or a strategic planning session, but from Wednesdays and sick days and community meetings and a child's preliminary floor plan and a man who said what he meant, was something simpler and harder than anything in her professional training. That the right things rarely fit the life you already designed. That showing up for something you don't fully understand is not the same as being reckless. That trust built slowly in small moments is the only kind that holds under weight. That a person who is the same in every room is worth paying attention to because the world is full of people who are only themselves when they have nothing to lose. That sometimes the most important decision you ever make is the one to go back. She had walked out in 11 minutes. She had spent 7 months coming back. Looking at the table now, at Ethan's hand over hers, at Mia industriously revising a floor plan, at the evening light on the cafe window, at the remains of a piece of pie and 2 coffee cups and a notebook full of documentation, she understood that the 11 minutes were not the story. They were just the wrong starting line. The real starting line was the second Sunday afternoon, the blueprints on the workbench, the word good in a text message, the rain on the doorstep, the drawing of a fig tree. It was specific and ordinary and inconvenient and entirely her own. It was enough. It was in every way she'd stopped believing in during the years of managing everything alone, exactly enough. Outside, the last of the evening light went gold on the street where 3 hypercars had once sat unnoticed, and the old pickup truck reflected it back the way useful things do, quietly, without asking to be seen. Mia finished her revision and looked up. "The desk is bigger now," she said, "and I added a window." Scarlett looked at the drawing. "The window's good," she said. "Keep the window." Mia clicked her pen with satisfaction and closed the notebook. The 3 of them stayed at the corner table while the cafe settled into evening around them. No urgency, no agenda, no calendar item waiting on the other side of the hour. Just the warm, unhurried, specific weight of being somewhere you chose to be, with people you didn't plan on, in the life that turned out to be better than the one you designed. That was all. That was everything.